Let's begin with a question no one has ever asked. What happens when you mix divine right monarchy, powdered wigs, and a deeply personal vendetta against bathtubs? You get Madame Victoire, daughter of Louis XV, and possibly the only royal in history whose enemies list included soap. Born in 1733, Marie-Louise Thérèse Victoire de France was the fifth daughter of Louis XV and Queen Marie Liszczynska. Now, when you hear princess, your mind might conjure up tiaras, fairy tale gowns, and graceful twirls in Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. And while Madame Victoire had access to all of that, she opted for something a little less sparkly, being extremely devout, a little awkward, and chronically anti-wash. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Louis XV's daughter refused to bathe, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. She was part of the exclusive clique known as Les Mesdames de France, or simply the Mesdames. These were the unmarried daughters of Louis XV, who lived together at court well into adulthood, like a royal sorority that really enjoyed embroidery and moral superiority. Think of them as the real housewives of Versailles. If no one got married and everyone had a firm belief that hygiene was out to kill them. Among this sisterhood, Madame Victoire stood out for being deeply religious, soft-spoken, and more comfortable with her prayer book than a party invitation, while her sisters, especially Adelaide, were sharper-tongued and tactfully active. Victoire was the one politely sitting in the background, nodding along and wondering whether her next confession should include that extra almond tart she snuck from the royal kitchen. But here's the twist. Despite her shy and unassuming personality, Victoire was engaged in a lifelong Cold War against personal cleanliness. That's right, behind those embroidered silk gowns and powdered cheeks was a woman who would rather be flayed by etiquette than touched by bathwater. Rumor had it that Victoire refused to bathe entirely, believing, like many of her time, that water was less cleansing and more certain unalive. Imagine, if you will, a woman of the highest status in France, living in one of the most gilded, over-the-top, etiquette-heavy palaces in Europe, who simply drew the line at soap. She had gold leaf on her hairbrush, but wouldn't go near running water unless it was holy. In fact, her cleanliness routine could best be described as medieval aromatherapy. Cover the smell and hope for the best. Now, let's be fair, Victoire wasn't being rebellious for the fun of it. Bathing in the 18th century was a whole thing, and not a pleasant one. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. Now, just picture a young royal raised in marble rooms, surrounded by peacocks, velvet drapes and candles that cost more than your rent, who genuinely thought that stepping into a tub could cause you to unalive of the vapors. She didn't hate cleanliness. She hated passing away. Unfortunately, her strategy to avoid it involved skipping centuries of soap. At court, Victoire's aversion to bathing was treated with a polite silence. No one confronted her directly, because A, she was a daughter of the king, and B, calling a princess funky wasn't career-safe behavior. But the smell? That spoke volumes. It's whispered in letters and diaries, the kind of passive-aggressive Versailles gossip that really shined when no one had a real job to do. Courtiers likely adjusted their wig powder before entering her salon, just in case it had to double as an air freshener. And yet, Victoire was beloved by many. Her loyalty to her sisters, her devotion to her faith, and her unshakable calm made her something of a comforting presence in the chaos of Versailles. She didn't involve herself in the tactful maneuvering or scandal that consumed much of the court. She was, in many ways, a quiet constant, a fixture, a very fragrant fixture. It's important to note that Victoire wasn't uniquely filthy for her time, just remarkably committed to staying that way. Many nobles avoided water like it owed them money, but Victoire turned it into a lifestyle, while others eventually dipped a toe in modernity. She held the musty line. Her refusal to bathe wasn't just personal, it was generational, symbolic, and wrapped in centuries of superstition. but it also set her apart in a palace already overflowing with characters. If Louis XV was the lover of luxury, and Louis XVI the doomed dreamer, then Madame Victoire was the royal anchor, resolute, composed, and stubbornly scented. So the next time you light a candle and draw a warm bath, think of Madame Victoire, who looked at that exact same scenario and said, "No thanks, I'll just dab on some more lavender oil and trust in God." And thus we begin the tale of the woman who conquered courtly life with grace, humility, and a nose-blind sense of confidence. If you've ever walked through the perfume section of a department store and thought, "Wow, this is overwhelming," then congratulations, you've had a tiny whiff of what it was like to walk through Versailles in the 1700s. But instead of being greeted by friendly salespeople offering spritzes of floral samples, imagine that every single person you encounter smells like a cocktail of ambergris, musk, rosewater, and at least one scent you can't quite identify but are certain is haunting you. Welcome to the royal court of Louis XV, a place where hygiene wasn't just misunderstood, it was actively feared. You didn't wash to get clean, you perfumed to pretend you had. Let's start with the basics. In 18th century Versailles, the concept of clean didn't mean what it means today. There were no loofahs, no minty body wash, no friendly reminder signs about hand washing in bathrooms. Mostly because there weren't really bathrooms. What people aimed for was not smelling terrible, and they did this not by removing dirt, but by smothering it with fragrance until the stench gave up. Perfume wasn't just a luxury in Versailles, it was a necessity, a fashion statement, and a survival tactic. Everyone wore it, nobles, courtiers, even their dogs. Yes, perfumed spaniels were a thing. Louis XV's court was famously known as la cour parfumée, the perfumed court. This wasn't a compliment, it was a coping mechanism. Here's why. Versailles stank, not metaphorically, literally. The palace was immense, yet most rooms had no plumbing, and chamber pots were often dumped wherever it was convenient. Stairwells, fireplaces, balconies, or just not at all. Add in hundreds of nobles, servants, sweating guards, and the occasional peacock wandering the halls, and you've got yourself a recipe for aristocratic aroma. So how did they manage? With layers upon layers of scent, perfume was applied to the skin, the hair, the clothes, the furniture, and even the wigs, which already had enough problems of their own, see lice, dust, and occasionally catching on fire. Courtiers carried scented handkerchiefs and wore gloves soaked in perfume, not because they liked the smell of violets, but because they were actively trying to mask the smell of the human sitting next to them. And here's the kicker. Bathing, the thing we do now to remove odor, was considered downright dangerous. This belief wasn't just ignorance, it was medical advice. According to prevailing 18th century health theories, particularly the miasma theory, illness came from bad air, foul vapors that could sneak into your body through the pores. And when you bathed, especially with hot water, those pores opened wide like unwelcome windows during a thunderstorm. The idea was simple. Clean skin equals open pores equals pass away. Doctors at the time were very helpful in spreading this fear. They warned patients that washing too often could upset the balance of bodily humors, weaken the body, and make you vulnerable to all manner of illness, from colds to full-on plague. So, if you thought your GP giving you antibiotics for a stubbed toe was questionable, be thankful he didn't prescribe staying dirty to protect your spleen. Washing the face and hands with water was sometimes acceptable, but full-body bathing? That was seen as something between reckless and suicidal. Most nobles had their dry clean-only system down to an art. Scrape, powder, perfume. Repeat. Let's talk powder. No, not the fun kind. This was body powder, a chalky, flour-like substance made from starch or crushed minerals. You'd rub it onto your skin to absorb oil and sweat, then top it off with perfume. It worked about as well as spraying air freshener on a dumpster, momentarily distracting, but not fooling anyone. And if you were lucky or unlucky, depending on your olfactory nerves, you'd catch a whiff of one of the more premium fragrances. These included ingredients like ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines, civet, extracted from the anal glands of a cat-like creature, So if your first instinct was to recoil at the idea of people not bathing, remember, they did care about how they smelled. They just did it in a way that required animal glands, denial, and an iron stomach. Of course, this olfactory masquerade wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about status. Perfume was expensive, elaborate, and often custom-made. A courtier who didn't smell like a botanical explosion was clearly either sick, poor, or dangerously normal. Versailles didn't do normal. So in this world, where physicians warned that soap was out to murder your bloodstream and a powdered neck was sexier than a washed one, Madame Victoire was not just fitting in, she was thriving. Her refusal to bathe wasn't lazy. It was socially acceptable, medically endorsed, and frankly fashion-forward. After all, washing too much could open your pores, and the only thing more terrifying than a draft at Versailles was your own immune system. When you hear the word Versailles, your brain might conjure images of golden mirrors, sprawling gardens, and opulent halls where powdered nobles danced under crystal chandeliers. But here's what your imagination probably leaves out: the stench. Because while Versailles was a marvel of architectural excess, one thing it absolutely tragically lacked was an understanding of basic plumbing. For all its gold leaf and fountains, the palace had no working toilets, and very little interest in solving that problem. The result? A palace where status reigned supreme, but so did the smell of last night's venison. Let's start with the numbers. By the time Versailles was in full swing under Louis XV, the palace was home to thousands, not just royals and nobles, but also their armies of servants, valets, tutors, cooks, dancers, and the occasional juggler. And how many toilets did they have to share? Very few. Actual privies were rare and usually reserved for the highest-ranking residents. Even those were more like glorified outhouses tucked into closets. For everyone else, nature's call came with a simple question: which corner of this national treasure shall I desecrate today? The go-to solution? The chamber pot. A porcelain bowl that lived under the bed behind a curtain, or if you were fancy, in a special chair with a hole in it. These were used liberally and emptied rarely. Courtiers would urinate behind tapestries, defecate in stairwells, and occasionally use the fireplaces for purposes that would horrify your local chimney sweep. Some visitors noted that navigating Versailles meant avoiding both gossip and unexpected puddles. If you think that sounds bad, it gets worse. These chamber pots weren't just for bedrooms. You could find them in salons, libraries, even tucked behind decorative screens in the Hall of Mirrors. The only real privacy you got was visual. Sound and smell, however, made themselves very much at home, and emptying them, not a daily ritual. In fact, servants often waited until the pot was full enough to justify the effort. That meant some chamber pots sat stewing beneath silk canopies for days, because nothing says elegance like ammonia and rosewater fighting for dominance. Now, you might wonder, surely someone thought to fix this. Some bright royal mind considered installing a proper sewer system. Not exactly. The architects of Versailles prioritized symmetry and grandeur over functionality. Drainage was an afterthought. Indoor plumbing was a myth. And for those rare few rooms that did have primitive toilets, there was no real way to dispose of the waste other than dumping it out windows or into shallow, open cesspits. If you were walking the gardens and thought it smelled earthy, that wasn't fertilizer, that was Versailles just being Versailles. But what about bathing, you ask? Surely some souls attempted a proper wash now and then. Technically, yes, but the process was so convoluted, uncomfortable and humiliating that most people opted out. To bathe, one needed to request an enormous wooden tub, essentially a barrel with aspirations. It would be dragged into your room by a team of servants, then slowly filled with water carried in buckets from the kitchens or nearby fountains. No plumbing, remember. Every gallon required manpower. Water was rarely hot, often lukewarm by the time it arrived, and filled the tub to something just short of kneecap level. Now add in the real Versailles experience. 4 to 6 people in the room helping undress you, scrub you, pour water on you and then dry you off, all while making sure your wig stayed on straight. It wasn't a bubble bath. It was a group project with splashing, grumbling and questionable aim. and there was no such thing as bathing in solitude. If you were important enough to deserve a bath, you were important enough to be watched while doing it. Bathing became a public event, an awkward ritual observed by bored courtiers, meddling doctors, and the occasional cousin. Modesty was sacrificed at the altar of etiquette, and hygiene became a theatrical ordeal. Even the kings weren't spared. Louis XV had an official bathing room with a tub and running water, a miracle for the time, but it was used so infrequently that many believed it was more symbolic than functional, sort of like a treadmill that holds your laundry. As a result, nobles came to regard bathing as less of a necessity and more of a heroic act. If someone admitted to washing, it was met with the same reaction you'd give someone who said, "I just ran across the Alps barefoot for fun," a mix of horror, awe, and polite concern. Which brings us back to our dear Madame Victoire. In this context, her refusal to bathe wasn't so much rebellion as self-preservation. She looked at the logistics, the cold water, the servants, the public humiliation, and decided, nope, I'm good with my rose-scented gloves and a stiff breeze, thank you very much. And who could blame her? Versailles was beautiful, yes, but it was also a palace where the marble gleamed, the fountains sparkled, and the only thing flowing freely was the smell of royal discomfort. So the next time you're annoyed about cleaning your bathroom, just be thankful it exists, because in the age of Madame Victoire, a bathroom was a bucket, a curtain, and a prayer. If you've ever ignored your doctor's advice to just rest and hydrate, congratulations, you would have fit right in at the French court in the 1700s. Because back then, medical advice wasn't so much based on science as it was on sheer audacity, and nothing sparked more controversy, fear, and physician pearl-clutching than water. Yes, in the 18th century, soap and warm baths were viewed by many doctors the way modern medicine views radioactive sludge. Intriguing, but best handled with tongs and a prayer. At the heart of this great medical misunderstanding was the ancient belief in the four humours, a theory dating back to Hippocrates, who, while brilliant for his time, also thought nosebleeds were caused by excess passion and hiccups, meant your spleen was feeling dramatic. According to humoral theory, the human body was governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If these got out of balance, say too much phlegm or not enough melancholy bile, your body would retaliate with everything from headaches to pass away. So where does bathing come in? Well, doctors feared that washing the body, especially with warm water, would open the pores, essentially leaving the drawbridge down for disease to gallop in and ransack your insides. Water, in their view, wasn't refreshing. It was inviting illness in for tea. According to many 18th century physicians, clean skin was vulnerable skin. The natural layer of sweat, dust, oil, and perfume crusting on the average noble's body was believed to act as a protective barrier like medieval armor, but flakier. Washing it off was like peeling the bark off a tree and then wondering why it got cold. If you looked shiny and fresh, it meant your body was dangerously exposed. And if you got sick after a bath, as many people did due to cold air, bacteria-infested tubs, or having 10 servants argue about towel temperature, the bath got the blame, not the fleas, spoiled goose liver, or cousin with active smallpox sitting next to you at dinner. This paranoia was backed up by the medical establishment, which had all the confidence of a talk and none of the data. The top physicians of the day had tools that mostly included leeches, because clearly the solution to illness is fewer fluids. Bloodletting knives, used to relieve everything from migraines to mild boredom. Mercury, which they happily prescribed for constipation, ulcers, and slowly poisoning yourself with dignity. And if those didn't work, there was always opium, which had the pleasant side effect of making you forget you were dying. In short, medicine was 30% superstition, Scott's 30% trial and error, and 40% pure vibes. So when Madame Victoire declined a bath, she wasn't just being difficult or lazy, she was being medically responsible by the standards of her time. Her physicians likely encouraged her to skip the tub, wrap herself in heavy gowns, and change her linens only when absolutely necessary, which, in her case, may have meant never. She was complying with expert advice, just the kind of expert who thought garlic could treat syphilis. and emotions were stored in the liver. To give Victoire some credit, she took health very seriously. Like many royal women of the period, she was intensely pious, conservative, and deeply afraid of anything that might disrupt the fragile harmony of her well-powdered body. That meant no risky behavior, and in Versailles, nothing said dangerous hedonist quite like a warm soak and a good scrub. Physicians of the court even warned against washing your hair too often. The scalp, they claimed, was a gateway to the soul. Clean it too vigorously, and you risked everything from nervous collapse to melancholia of the uterus, a delightful catch-all diagnosis for women who seemed a bit sad or, horror of horrors, outspoken. Some doctors were even more specific in their anti-bath policies. They argued that the smell of soap itself could provoke fits of hysteria or interfere with digestion. One even recommended that people air themselves near a window instead, not bathe. Just open the window and let the breeze hit you in the general face region. Problem solved. So when Victoire resisted all forms of washing, she wasn't rebelling against norms, she was upholding them. To her, bathing wasn't self-care, it was a gamble with unalive. And frankly, a risk she didn't need to take when she had access to gallons of imported perfume and a prayer schedule, as detailed as a military operation. In hindsight, she may have had a point, because in a century where your doctor's top 3 tools were leeches, opium, and guesswork, skipping a bath might have been her smartest move. At Versailles, perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a full-time olfactory strategy, and for Madame Victoire, daughter of Louis XV and committed avoider of anything involving soap and splash, it was practically a defense mechanism. She didn't just wear perfume, she armed herself with it. While some people put on a dab before leaving the house, Madame Victoire put on enough to smother a riot. Let's be clear, this wasn't your light floral spritz from a modern department store. We're talking heavy-duty, musk-infused, flower-suffocated clouds of scent that could hold a corridor hostage. Perfume in 18th century France was a weapon of social survival, and in Madame Victoire's case, nasal warfare. Perfumers at the French court were as vital as tailors or chefs. Custom blends were concocted for royals like Victoire, based on their preferences, their health complaints, or sometimes, let's be honest, their odor severity level. These concoctions often contained ingredients like ambergris, whale vomit, but fancy, civet, glandular secretions of a cat-like animal, and generous amounts of crushed flowers, herbs, spices, and alcohol. The result? Something that could best be described as a bouquet that had been caught in a thunderstorm of musk and then aged in a drawer full of antique wigs. And that was the point. Perfume, to someone like Madame Victoire, wasn't simply decorative, it was compensatory. If she wasn't going to bathe, she needed a way to still glide through Versailles without making a room recoil. Perfume became her shield, her signature, and let's be real, her air freshener. The French court at Versailles was practically dripping in fragrance. Royals and courtiers wore scented gloves, carried perfumed sachets, and even had fragrance-infused fans. There were entire ceremonies around choosing the right perfume. Some aristocrats had morning scents and evening scents, as well as emergency mask-the-chamber pot colognes for particularly pungent moments. Madame Victoire likely had her own personal perfumer on call. These artisans weren't just mixing lavender and rosewater in a jar, they were trained to balance complex ingredients and produce concoctions that would not only please the royal nose, but also outcompete the nose-wrinkling reality of Versailles' less-than-stellar sanitation. Think of it as alchemy meets aromatherapy meets industrial air pollution control. Applying perfume wasn't a quick spritz and go, it was a ritual. The royal dressing process, called the toilette, was an elaborate public affair. In the case of Madame Victoire, this likely involved attendants layering her with fragrance as if applying layers of armor. Behind each dab, drop and dusting was a careful calculation. Enough to overwhelm, never enough to admit defeat. And yes, there was a limit to the madness. Overdoing the perfume could make one seem desperate, or worse, lower class. But Madame Victoire as a princess could afford to be liberal. After all, who was going to tell the king's daughter she smelled like a walking florist trapped in a spice market? There was also the belief that strong perfumes didn't just mask odors, they actively protected against disease. Remember, this was the miasma theory era when people thought bad smells caused illness. A strong scent then wasn't just pleasant, it was a health barrier. In a way, Madame Victoire was wrapping herself in an invisible cloak of medical protection. The stinkier the real world, the more scented her counterattack. She wasn't avoiding bathing, she was warding off airborne evil. If someone got the plague, it clearly wasn't her fault. She had on bergamot. It said that people could smell Madame Victoire before they saw her. That might sound rude today, but at Versailles, it was practically a power move. Her scent entered a room before she did, warning both admirers and fainting servants that royalty was en route. And while we might recoil at the idea of never bathing and instead piling on enough scent to knock over a horse, remember this was standard elite behavior. Perfume wasn't cheating, it was strategy. Imagine Madame Victoire walking past a hall of courtiers. Some cough discreetly, a maid faints in the corner, a nobleman sneezes into his ruffled sleeve. But Madame Victoire? She smiles. Why? Because that was the sound of victory. Her perfume had struck again. If you could smell her coming, congratulations, you were still half a hallway away. She wore fragrance like armor, and boy did it fight. Welcome to Versailles, where the dresses were stitched with gold, the etiquette guides were thicker than the Bible, and the bathtubs were mostly decorative. Madame Victoire may be our headline act, but don't mistake her for a lone hygienic rebel. She had backup, and lots of it. Meet the Mesdames de France, the original royal girl gang. These were the daughters of King Louis XV and Queen Marie Leszczyńska, and though Victoire was just one of several sisters, they all came with matching monograms, matching mindsets, and yes, matching distaste for regular bathing. This was not a story of one woman snubbing soap. This was a movement, or at least a very fragrant resistance. Let's roll call the crew. Adelaide, the eldest and most outspoken. Victoire, the more timid yet determined one. Sophie, quiet but firm in her traditions. And Louise, who eventually fled palace life for a convent. These women were, in many ways, frozen in time, not just by powdered wigs and brocade gowns, but by the unique stasis of being royal daughters who were too noble to marry down and too tactfully inconvenient to marry up. The result? They stayed home, for life, in the palace, together. Now, a house full of adult sisters might sound charming if you're picturing Jane Austen's drawing rooms and tea service, but at Versailles, it was more like a lifelong sleepover where everyone wore a corset, no one ever got their turn at the throne, and emotional support came in the form of rosaries and rosewater. And while modern spa days are meant to bond women, the Mesdames found sisterly unity in avoiding them altogether. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. Etiquette was. Here's the thing, despite their royal birth, the Mesdames lived with surprisingly limited freedoms. In an age where royal marriages were chess moves, they were pawns that never left the board. Most of their lives were orchestrated by rules thicker than their rouge. They had schedules, social obligations, religious duties, and a never-ending series of ceremonial events. But romantic freedom, personal adventure, forget it. Their father, Louis XV, may have been busy pursuing his pleasures in the private wings of Versailles, but his daughters were often left in a kind of golden purgatory. They weren't married off, whether due to tactful decisions, lack of viable suitors, or their own hesitations, and instead grew into adulthood steeped in ritual, tradition, and family loyalty. So they did what many of us do when we have too much time and not enough therapy. They clung to each other, and they judged hard. They judged the modern fashions coming out of Paris, the progressive ideas of the Enlightenment, and especially the women of court, who heaven forbid showed a little ankle or took a lover. Their moral compass was tightly wound and generally pointed toward religious piety, social rigidity, and suspicion of change. And when your whole identity is built around maintaining the old ways, you don't just accept bathing with open arms because someone invented a towel warmer. No, you lean in. You marinate in tradition. Literally. Many of the Mesdames were deeply religious. Louise eventually left court life and joined a Carmelite convent, embracing poverty and prayer over perfumed palace life. But even before that, religion provided a framework of comfort, identity, and importantly, justification. If God wanted them to be clean, surely he'd have put a bidet in the book of Genesis. Until then, holy water would do just fine. It's important not to confuse their habits with laziness or vanity. This wasn't a matter of being pampered brats refusing a shower. These were women born into a world where bathing had long been medically, morally, and socially complicated. They grew up in rooms where doctors said warm water could weaken the nerves, where spiritual advisors warned against nakedness, and where gossip traveled faster than soap suds. In short, they weren't unclean. They were loyal. To tradition, to each other, and regrettably to Musk. And don't think they were unpopular. The Mesdames wielded real influence at court, tactfully, socially, and culturally. Their apartments were the epicenter of old guard royalism, the last stronghold of stiff-spined resistance against Enlightenment ideals and upstart reformers. They saw themselves as protectors of the crown's dignity. And if that dignity came scented with a thick layer of ambergris and myrrh, so be it. Their presence loomed large even after Louis XV's passing. As the reign of Louis XVI began, the Mesdames, now aging, widowed by potential futures they never had, remained fixtures of the court. They were a constant reminder of an older France, one foot in powdered tradition, the other in a chamber pot behind a silk curtain. So yes, Victoire didn't bathe, but neither did Adelaide or Sophie or Louise for much of her court life. Together they created a bubble of ritualistic resistance to the creeping modernity all around them. It wasn't just about soap. It was about control, about clinging to something in a world that was quite literally revolting. Because if you're going to go down with the ancien regime, you may as well do it with your sisters, your powdered wigs, and a perfume cloud thick enough to block out the French Revolution. In the rarefied world of 18th century French royalty, every decision what you wore, who you spoke to, and yes, how often you bathed, was a tactful act. For Madame Victoire and her elite, refraining from washing wasn't just about superstition or medical paranoia, though those were definitely involved. It was also a deliberate way to separate the wheat from the revolution-prone chaff. And if that wheat had gone sour and smelled faintly of mouldy lavender, even better. At Versailles, status wasn't simply declared, it was scented. You didn't need to bathe. Bathing was for the bourgeoisie, the rising middle class with their crisp linens, shiny shoes, and wild revolutionary ideas about liberty, equality, and soap. If you were truly noble, you didn't just inherit land and titles, you inherited a long-standing fear of suds. To understand this royal aversion to cleanliness, you need to look at the social divides of the era. The upper echelons of society were obsessed with keeping the lower classes at a symbolic and literal distance. One way to do that was to embrace behaviors that common folk couldn't afford or wouldn't understand, like wearing a powdered wig the size of a carriage wheel, or insisting that chamber music be played during every meal, or, in Madame Victoire's case, skipping every bath for decades and replacing it with a cloud of bergamot and privilege. In this sense, hygiene, or lack thereof, became a form of passive resistance to modernity. As new Enlightenment ideals trickled into society, ideas that emphasized science, progress, and the occasional rinse, some aristocrats doubled down on tradition. Nothing said, "I am not one of you," quite like choosing to smell like a musk-scented library that's been sealed since Louis XIV died. Madame Victoire, along with her sisters, didn't just avoid bathing, they almost wore their grime like a badge of honor, as if cleanliness would somehow wash away their nobility. To embrace hygiene too enthusiastically was to flirt with egalitarianism. After all, how could one maintain their divine right to rule if they shared grooming habits with bankers and teachers? This wasn't merely a personal choice, it was a social signal. By avoiding bathing, nobles subtly, or not so subtly, indicated their rejection of new money practices and Enlightenment rationalism. Cleanliness began to carry subtext. It meant you read pamphlets, maybe dabbled in science, or gasp, sympathized with Rousseau. Before long, smelling like fresh linen might as well have been waving a red flag in the Hall of Mirrors. There's a certain irony here. While the monarchy clung to its increasingly musty ways in an attempt to project superiority, the rising classes were scrubbing themselves clean and questioning why these perfumed fossils were still in charge. If history had a nose, it probably wrinkled around 1789. It's also important to note that Victoire and her ilk weren't doing nothing. No, they were actively resisting cleanliness. They had regimens, rituals, layers of powders, oils and perfumes. Their rooms reeked of incense and rosewater-soaked linens. It wasn't laziness, it was tactful via passive warfare. This trend reached absurd heights. There were nobles who reportedly refused to wash their faces for fear it would wash away their complexion. Others wore small perfume-soaked sponges hidden in jewelry, which they'd periodically sniff like aristocratic Vicks inhalers. And don't even ask what was happening with their wigs. Let's just say more than one had to be fumigated before a ball. With smoke. Indoors. Madame Victoire wasn't an outlier. She was a poster child for this form of olfactory elitism. In her world, your scent wasn't just a personal matter. It was a class declaration. Poor people smelled of labor. Royals? They smelled like they were above labor. And showers. And if the result was a sort of weaponized musk that could fell a footman at 20 paces, well, at least no one would mistake her for a merchant's wife. Let's be clear, this wasn't just about snobbery, it was about fear. The French monarchy was increasingly terrified of appearing weak, modern, or out of step with its own mythology. Bathing, simple, sensible, squeaky clean bathing was a threat because it represented change. And change by the late 1700s was coming in fast and sharp, with guillotines. So when Madame Victoire refused to bathe, she wasn't just protecting her pores. She was performing a centuries-old role. Noble woman, untouchable, uninterested in your soap. Her defiance was fragrant, flowery, and rooted in a deep distrust of anything that smelled remotely democratic. If you were an unsuspecting diplomat, or noble visiting Versailles for the first time in the late 18th century, you might have come prepared for many things: stiff wigs, endless protocol, an uncomfortable amount of powdered faces, but nothing, absolutely nothing could prepare you for the olfactory gauntlet that awaited in the salons of the Mesdames de France. To say that Madame Victoire and her sisters had a distinctive scent would be like saying the Hall of Mirrors had a couple of chandeliers. It was a sensory experience, full-bodied, immersive, and borderline hostile. Accounts from the period, though often couched in diplomatic politeness or satirical wit, hint that visitors to the royal daughter's chambers needed more than just proper etiquette. They needed iron lungs. Let's start with the logistics. The Mesdames, particularly Victoire and her closest sister Adelaide, resided in their own apartments within the palace, with servants, visitors, tutors, and occasional physicians trickling through daily. These salons were not vast, breezy spaces. They were heavily draped, tightly sealed to keep out drafts, and filled with plush upholstery, the kind of furniture that could absorb both secrets and smells. Ventilation was minimal. Candles were always burning, and the general air circulation was more of a suggestion than a reality. Now imagine that into this softly stewing ecosystem walked a pair of royal women who hadn't bathed in weeks, or by many accounts months. But don't worry, they had a solution: perfume, lots of it. They were practically marinating in it, and not the delicate citrus sprays you might spritz before a dinner party today. We're talking animal musk-heavy perfumes, crafted from ingredients like civet, a secretion from a small cat-like animal, and ambergris, a waxy lump from whale intestines. These scents were bold, assertive, and not particularly apologetic. One unfortunate soul, a minor diplomat from a lesser-known German state, allegedly fainted mid-conversation with Madame Victoire. The official record blamed the excitement of meeting royalty. The unofficial whispers blamed the ambient air quality, which reportedly resembled a barber's back room mixed with a hot stable. Madame Campan, who served as a lady-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette, and thus had plenty of first-hand access to the royal gossip grapevine, hinted in her memoirs that the Mesdames were very set in their ways and averse to innovations of cleanliness. That's 18th century French noble speak for, you could smell them coming. Satirical letters circulated in salons comparing Victoire's rooms to alchemical labs or suggesting that entering their quarters was like being baptized by aroma. Enlightenment writers, not known for holding back, joked that the Mesdames were preserving old France, literally, in layers of unwashed lace and historical funk. Foreign visitors often had no idea what they were walking into. Ambassadors from more modern courts like Austria or Prussia sometimes returned home with hilarious, horrified tales. One English visitor dryly noted in a letter that he had met several of the king's daughters and found them gracious, intelligent, and possessed of a powerful presence. Again, when a Brit says powerful, it doesn't always mean commanding. The Mesdames, for their part, did not appear to find any of this strange. They had grown up in a world where bathing was considered dangerous, where physical purity was less important than religious piety, and where tradition meant more than innovation. Their rooms were perfumed, their wigs were powdered, their gowns were immaculate. Why then should anyone mind the smell? In their minds they were the pinnacle of old-world elegance, a living monument to the ancien regime. If you walked in and your nose disagreed, that was your problem. And let's not forget, the smell wasn't just personal. It was tactful. These were daughters of a king, defenders of the old ways in an increasingly rebellious France. To be perfumed rather than washed wasn't laziness, it was a statement, a scented, swirling middle finger to Enlightenment ideals of cleanliness and order. Soap is for radicals, they might as well have said. We'll stick with tradition and whale vomit. For courtiers, the best defense was an equally offensive offense. Visitors often brought scented handkerchiefs, soaked in lavender or clove oil, and would hold them delicately to their noses during long audiences. Not out of snobbery, mind you, just basic survival. Others developed more creative strategies, pretending to sneeze, faking coughing fits, or artfully maneuvering themselves toward windows. But despite the whispered jokes and diplomatic dodges, no one dared openly criticize the Mesdames. They were still the king's daughters. Mocking them too loudly could result in a loss of favor, or worse, being summoned back for another visit. In the end, Madame Victoire and her sisters became living relics of a vanishing world. Their chambers, thick with the sense of history, religion, and patchouli, were more than just rooms. They were olfactory time capsules. And if you emerged from one of them without a migraine or the desire to revolutionize public hygiene, congratulations, you were made of stronger stuff than most. Next time someone says smell is the strongest sense tied to memory, remember the Mesdames. Versailles remembered them too, in every thick velvet curtain and clove-scented breeze. If the court of Versailles was a powder-scented bubble of tradition, the French Revolution was a flaming pin. And when that pin popped the monarchy, Madame Victoire and her sisters didn't just lose their titles and tapestries, they lost their odor-tolerant stronghold. But don't be fooled. While they were running for their lives, they weren't running for the nearest bathhouse. As the storm of revolution thundered across France, Louis XV's daughters, the Mesdames, joined the noble exodus, heading for safer and slightly more republican pastures. Victoire, Adelaide, and a caravan of equally concerned courtiers made a dramatic escape in 1791, weaving their way through a collapsing tactful order. They arrived in Italy like regal tumbleweeds, trailed by luggage, rosaries, and a few extra decades worth of personal scent. But if you thought exile might have inspired a little hygienic reconsideration, you clearly underestimate their commitment to stench. Once the sisters reached Rome and settled in Naples, they promptly re-established their routines and their resistance to water. Imagine the Pope's staff politely realizing that the visiting French princesses didn't so much arrive as waft. Local observers, never ones to pass up some fragrant gossip, were both confused and horrified. Letters from Neapolitan courtiers diplomatically described the Mesdames as attached to their ways, which is aristocratic code for why does this entire villa smell like a haunted sachet. Italian servants reportedly asked to be reassigned, while hosts suddenly remembered they had urgent pilgrimages to attend. Who knew centuries of tradition could smell like aggressively steeped musk and despair? Even amidst collapse and personal displacement, Victoire and Adelaide clung to their hygienic philosophy like a rosary, unyielding, sacred, and scented with regrets. It wasn't just nostalgia. They saw their rituals as part of their identity. To bathe would have been to admit defeat, or worse, to admit that the Enlightenment might have had a point. This wasn't just peculiar personal behavior, it was a slow, perfumed protest. In the face of modernity, the Mesdames doubled down on the old ways. Just because they were homeless didn't mean they'd start doing things like, say, scrubbing behind their ears. Those ears had heard the coronation of their father. They had survived the fawning whispers of 1,000 flatterers. They had earned the right to be, let's say, atmospherically distinct. Now, to be fair, exile was no picnic. The royal pension was a pale shadow of its former glory, the carriages were stuffy, and the powdered wigs didn't hold up well under Mediterranean humidity. But while other émigrés adjusted, the Mesdames simply added more perfume. No running water? No problem. They had bottles of lavender oil, sachets of clove-stuffed linen, and the unwavering belief that if something smells strong enough it must be clean. Spoiler, it was not. Their religious routines also intensified. With revolution chasing them and their royal world crumbling, the sisters turned even more fervently to their Catholic faith. But while the saints were invoked frequently, soap never was. If holiness and humility were to be found in suffering, then perhaps theirs was just the scent of martyrdom or mildew. And yet, amidst all this, the Mesdames were treated mostly with respect. Foreign courts still saw them as symbolic remnants of old France. They were hosted in villas, received by nobles, and allowed to live out their years in relatively peaceful exile. Of course, this came with some whispered commentary and a lot of open windows. Eventually, time caught up with them. Madame Victoire died in Trieste in 1799, reportedly never having broken her anti-bathing vow. Adelaide followed soon after. Their belongings were catalogued and distributed, though one imagines some items, particularly the more odorific ones, were handled with tongs and blessed salt water. It's hard not to marvel at their stubbornness. In a century marked by revolution, reason and reinvention, these women held fast to lace, incense, and the perfume-soaked ghosts of Versailles. Even when their palace turned to rubble and their titles turned to liabilities, they refused to turn the faucet. The funny part, their commitment to unwashed dignity might have been the most consistent, tactful statement of their lives, in a world upended by egalitarian ideals and soap-wielding peasants. Madame Victoire and her sisters said, loud and fragrant, "No, thank you." They marched, or at least drifted slowly through exile, with all the powdered grace of a world that no longer existed. They didn't just flee the revolution, they fumed their way through it. Madame Victoire of France died in 1799, in the twilight haze of an old world swept away by revolution, guillotines, and the Enlightenment's increasingly pushy fondness for soap. She passed away in exile in Trieste, far from the perfume-choked halls of Versailles, but with her hygiene habits very much intact. Yes, according to most accounts, she likely left this world in the same fragrant fog she had lived in, unbathed, powdered, and still believing water was best left for drinking or rowing across, not for soaking in. In many ways, her refusal to bathe was more than a quirky footnote in French history. It was a kind of olfactory rebellion. Victoire was not merely a soapless spinster out of habit or laziness. She represented a vanishing world of superstitions wrapped in silks, where etiquette ruled, the body was a suspicious creature, and perfume had the job of both armor and an aesthetic. The world she came from believed deeply in appearances, and ironically not in cleanliness. The elite at Versailles embraced fashion, etiquette, religion, and deeply outdated science with equal fervor, and hygiene? That was for peasants, soldiers, and increasingly those suspicious Enlightenment types with ideas about germs. If you smelled too clean, people assumed you were either ill or dangerously modern. Victoire wasn't avoiding water out of ignorance. She was doing it to stay firmly planted on the right side of tradition, superstition, and status. While Victoire herself left no memoirs unless one counts the unspoken testimony of her abandoned bathtubs, we can trace her legacy through the odd reactions of those who encountered her. Foreign ambassadors, guests, and memoirists often hinted delicately or not so delicately at the thick air surrounding the Mesdames. More than one commentator wrote with thinly veiled horror about the atmosphere in their rooms, often with phrases like heavy with incense or the cloying scent of ritual. That's 18th century code for something died in here, and it might have been yesterday's goose pâté. And yet, despite the nose wrinkling, she endured. More than that, she outlasted the court that had defined her. The revolution toppled the monarchy, erased the customs, and quite literally dismantled the palace plumbing such as it was. But Victoire's ways persisted. Even in exile, far from Versailles, she clung to her perfume bottles like lifelines. Whether in Rome or Trieste, she continued to dress in outdated styles, maintain rigid schedules, and of course remain suspicious of soap and water like they were revolutionary agents in disguise. There's something almost admirable about her consistency. In an era when nobles were shaving their heads to avoid the guillotine and pretending they liked trousers, Victoire stood firm. She was loyal to her family, her god, her powder puffs, and her musk. She may not have believed in republicanism, but she sure believed in ritual, especially if it involved lavender oil and zero bath water. When she finally passed away at the age of 71, it marked more than just the end of a life. It was the slow exhale of an entire world that had resisted change for as long as powdered wigs could hold out. She had witnessed the fall of the ancien regime, the passing of her father Louis XV, the rise and execution of her nephew Louis XVI, and the transformation of France into something unrecognizable. Through it all, she never once traded her rituals for reality. History turned the page, but she was still there in the margins, perfumed and unbothered. Her hygiene habits, while bizarre to modern readers, stand as a peculiar symbol of how power, fear, and status can contort everyday behavior. Cleanliness, to us, feels like common sense. To Victoire, it felt like surrender. In her world, medicine distrusted water, etiquette discouraged openness, and the senses were meant to be overwhelmed, not soothed. She wasn't gross. She was a product of her time, just one that happened to smell like powdered myrrh and rosewater at all times. Today she's remembered as one of the odder relics of a bygone age, a walking contradiction, devout yet aloof, elegant yet odorous, royal yet rigid. But more than anything, she's proof that absurdity isn't the opposite of history. It is history. The fact that a French princess once went her entire life likely without a proper bath is both hilarious and illuminating. So the next time you take a hot shower, light a vanilla-scented candle, and sigh in steamy gratitude, just remember, you are violating every instinct Madame Victoire had about survival. But don't worry, her spirit lives on, probably somewhere between the curtain and the chamber pot, and it still doesn't approve. Long before electric toothbrushes with Bluetooth connectivity judged your plaque buildup, and centuries before bristles met plastic handles in fluorescent colors, humans had one very simple goal: not to have their teeth fall out of their face. And so, in the dusty heartlands of ancient Mesopotamia, some clever soul around 3000 BCE looked at a tree, picked off a twig, chewed one end until it frayed and said, "Yep, that'll do." Thus was born one of humanity's earliest oral hygiene tools, the chewing stick. These sticks were not a desperate substitute. They were a global phenomenon with roots quite literally in multiple civilizations. The Babylonians used them. The ancient Egyptians buried them alongside the dead because eternal halitosis was apparently not acceptable. Over in the Indus Valley, people were doing the same thing, and in India and Arabia, the miswak, a particular type of chewing stick from the Salvadora persica tree, was more than just a wooden toothpick with dreams. It was a sacred, science-backed, spit-polished superstar of dental care. Let's set the scene. Picture a Babylonian nobleman 5,000 years ago, cloaked in linen, cuneiform tablets nearby, chomping thoughtfully on a stick. He isn't pretending to smoke it like a philosopher pipe. He's cleaning his teeth with it. No bristles, no toothpaste, just fiber, friction, and faith. These sticks worked because they were designed by nature with an unintentional assist from evolving bacteria. Chewing the end of the stick would fray the fibers into a brush-like tip. This created a tool that could scrape away food particles, stimulate gums, and possibly confuse nearby goats. And the best part? Many of these trees, like Salvadora persica, had natural antimicrobial properties. So while modern humans debate fluoride levels and whitening strips, ancient folk were casually brushing with a stick that also acted as a built-in mouthwash. The miswak, in particular, earned quite the dental resume. Scientific studies today have actually confirmed that Salvadora persica contains antibacterial compounds, fluoride, silica, a natural abrasive, and even tannins that protect gums. In other words, it's nature's version of a 3-in-1 toothpaste, floss, and breath mint. No wonder the Prophet Muhammad was an enthusiastic promoter of the miswak in Islamic tradition. It was a sunnah habit with surprisingly advanced science behind it. Brush like the Prophet? Absolutely. Brush like a medieval European? Hard pass. In Egypt, tooth cleaning was also embedded into religious practice. Priests were known to clean their teeth regularly because gods apparently preferred fresh breath with their prayers. The concept of oral cleanliness was tied directly to spiritual cleanliness, making the chewing stick not just a hygiene tool but a sacred one. It was oral health with divine endorsement. Now, these ancient tooth sticks weren't uniform across regions. In India, neem twigs were used for their antiseptic qualities. In Africa, various fibrous plants were selected for their cleaning power and mouth-freshening potential. These weren't mass-produced tools, but local, hand-plucked solutions. Need a new toothbrush? Just walk outside and yank one off a tree. Sustainability level 10/10, packaging waste 0%, and forget modern toothbrush holders. The chewing stick was portable, reusable, biodegradable, and if you were really committed, edible. Try that with a battery-powered toothbrush from your local pharmacy. Worst-case scenario with a miswak. You swallow a twig. Best-case scenario, your mouth stays clean and you don't scare your neighbors with your breath. Now let's be honest, technique mattered. You couldn't just gnaw on a stick like a stressed-out beaver and hope for the best. Ancient users had styles, rubbing in circular motions, vertical brushing along the gum line, even chewing rhythmically. Some used 2 sticks per session, because why not dual-wield hygiene? The chewing stick wasn't an act of desperation, it was a morning ritual, a status symbol, and in some cases a performance. But while the elite might have used silver-sheathed versions or perfumed varieties, chewing sticks were surprising. Whether you were a priest, a merchant, or just some poor farmer who'd like to keep their teeth through winter, the chewing stick was your best friend. And the impact? These tools weren't perfect, but they worked. Archaeological remains from ancient tombs show better than expected dental health in societies that embraced chewing sticks. Sure, they didn't have floss or fluoride, but they weren't completely toothless cavemen either. Of course, this practice wasn't eternal. As cultures evolved, so did grooming habits. And once bristles on a handle came into play, we'll get to that pig hair monstrosity in the next chapter. The humble stick began to fade, at least in the West. But to this day, millions across the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia still swear by the miswak. It's approved by the World Health Organization. It's cheap, it's effective, it doesn't need charging, and best of all, it never runs out of batteries mid-brush. In the end, it all began with a twig, a frayed tip, and a whole lot of dental hope. Who needs bristles when you've got twigs and a prayer? Long before oral hygiene became a billion-dollar industry, and long before anyone uttered the phrase minty fresh, the Chinese were busy revolutionizing how we scrub the grime off our teeth. Welcome to the Tang dynasty, around 6119 CE, where the quest for cleaner mouths took a bold and bristly leap forward. Forget twigs and herbs for a moment. The Chinese wanted something with a bit more texture. Enter the first true toothbrush. This pioneering gadget featured coarse hog bristles jammed into a handle made of bamboo or bone. It was a brilliant, if slightly uncomfortable upgrade from chewing on sticks. After all, there's something delightfully straightforward about scraping your teeth with animal hair while pondering the mysteries of the universe. The hog bristles, often harvested from the necks of wild boars in the colder northern provinces of China, where pigs apparently grew their equivalent of wool sweaters, were prized for their stiffness and durability. Sure, they were coarse enough to scratch enamel off if you weren't careful, but you couldn't argue with the results. For the first time, people had a reusable tool dedicated solely to cleaning their teeth, no longer relying on twigs, cloths, or sheer optimism. Now, if you're wondering who looked at a wild pig and thought, "I want that hair in my mouth," congratulations, you're asking the right historical questions. The Chinese didn't shy away from using what nature provided, and pigs, it turns out, were both plentiful and conveniently hairy. A perfect match. These early toothbrushes were handcrafted with surprising elegance. The bamboo or bone handles were sometimes ornately carved, especially for wealthier users. So yes, even back in the 7th century you could flex on your neighbors by having a toothbrush handle that doubled as a status symbol. Some things never change. The invention wasn't just clever, it spread. Centuries later, this design would slowly make its way westward along trade routes like the Silk Road. But by the time Europeans got their hands on these pig hair prototypes, they had opinions. Oh, did they have opinions? First came the shock. Europeans weren't used to the idea of brushing one's teeth daily. They were still in the phase of swishing wine around their mouths and hoping it counted as cleaning. So when they encountered a brush full of animal hair, reactions ranged from skeptical to horrified. Imagine handing a 16th century nobleman a toothbrush and watching him recoil like you'd just offered him a hedgehog on a stick. Then came the controversy. Soft bristles versus stiff bristles. The Chinese favored the firm stuff, something that could really dig in there and sweep out the remnants of pickled vegetables and sticky rice. But some early adopters in Europe discovered that the stiff bristles were not for the faint of gum. The sensation was somewhere between a back scratch and a barbed wire flossing session. This led to experimentation with softer bristles, sometimes made from horsehair or even feathers. Spoiler alert, neither of those were particularly effective. So while the idea of brushing caught on, the exact materials were constantly debated. Dental hygiene was a bit of a toothy trial and error game for centuries. The toothbrush also wasn't a tool in the beginning. In China, it was mostly used by scholars, nobility, and wealthy merchants. People who could afford not only the tool but also cared about preserving their teeth past the age of 30. For the average peasant, a quick rinse and a prayer were more the style, but among the elite, the toothbrush became part of daily ritual and self-discipline. Clean teeth, clear conscience, Confucian values. Interestingly, the design was so effective it stuck around for hundreds of years with very little modification. Bristle-to-bone construction continued well into the Ming dynasty, and even after the concept spread to Europe in the 17th century, it was essentially unchanged, just localized. In England, bristles were imported from Siberia, and the bones often came from cattle. If nothing else, it was a united effort in dental discomfort. Of course, hygiene standards back then didn't involve fancy toothpaste, flavored gels, or ultrasonic brushes. Most people used crushed herbs, ashes, salt, or even chalk to coat their pig hair bristles. So brushing was a full sensory experience, one that included the taste of soot, the smell of pork, and the occasional gag reflex. Romantic, isn't it? Still, we have to give credit where credit is due. China's invention wasn't just functional, it was transformative. It laid the groundwork, one stiff hog hair at a time, for what would eventually become the modern toothbrush. Sure, the materials were a bit rough, but the intention was clear. Nobody wanted to go through life with dragon breath and molars held together by luck. And so the humble Chinese toothbrush became one of history's great, underappreciated inventions. Because nothing says hygiene quite like scraping your incisors with the follicular remains of a pig. Let's set the scene. It's the Middle Ages in Europe. Castles are drafty, chamber pots are casually dumped from second-story windows, and hygiene is best described as an optimistic rumor. If you think brushing your teeth wasn't a priority, you'd be correct, and you'd be doing better than most of the people who lived at the time. In fact, when it came to dental care, medieval Europeans embraced a philosophy best summed up as don't ask, don't smell. Toothbrushes, never heard of them. Toothpaste sounds suspiciously like sorcery. Instead, most folks resorted to the occasional scrub with a rough cloth, sometimes dipped in ashes or ground up herbs, because nothing freshens breath quite like the remnants of yesterday's fire pit. One popular option for those seeking that clean feeling was rinsing with wine or vinegar. Not for the taste, though, let's be honest. Some were probably doing both, but for its perceived cleansing properties. After all, wine killed bacteria, right? Technically, yes. Did it help your teeth? Not exactly. Medieval mouths still reeked of decay, stew, and despair, but now with a pleasant Cabernet aftertaste. If you were wealthy, you might have access to a more refined regimen. Aristocrats occasionally dabbled in mouthwashes made from rosemary, mint, or even crushed pearls, because if you're going to do something poorly, you may as well do it extravagantly. But these were rare exceptions in a sea of molars held together by plaque and prayer. And speaking of wealth, here's where things get especially bizarre. Bad breath and blackened teeth were sometimes seen as marks of high status. Yes, in a world where sugar was an expensive delicacy imported from the East, rotting teeth could signal that you had enough money to wreck your own mouth. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of driving a luxury car into a ditch just to prove you owned it. Among the peasantry, dental care was minimal at best. Food was coarse, fibrous, and often full of grit. So ironically, the average farmer may have had slightly better teeth than the sugar-sucking upper crust. But this wasn't thanks to hygiene. It was thanks to chewing tough bread that could double as a whetstone. You didn't brush your teeth, you sanded them down over a lifetime. Toothaches, meanwhile, were handled with the same subtlety as everything else in the medieval medical world, with violence, superstition, or a hearty application of alcohol. Remedies ranged from the relatively benign, chewing cloves or garlic, to the delightfully deranged, placing a dead mouse on the gums or whispering prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Modern dentistry it was not, and when things got really bad, and they often did, it was off to the local barber surgeon, a man whose credentials included cutting hair, applying leeches, and yanking teeth with the precision of a drunk blacksmith. These extractions weren't exactly gentle. Anesthetic was either a stiff drink or being hit hard enough to forget the pain. Gums bled, screams echoed, people cheered when it was over, because now you only had to worry about the gaping hole where your tooth used to be. But if your teeth did fall out, and they would, you had options. The booming wooden tooth industry was there to help. No, they weren't as elegant as George Washington's famously misattributed wooden dentures, but crude prosthetics did exist. Some people wore carved wooden plugs. Others used dentures made from animal bone, ivory, or the teeth of dead people. Yes, dead people. There was a whole market for second-hand smiles. So if your village graveyard seemed a little emptier of jawbones, now you know why. It wasn't until centuries later that the toothbrush, long used in China, began to slowly crawl into Europe, only to be met with confusion and disinterest. Europeans had spent hundreds of years thinking that rubbing soot on your gums was enough. Why change now? And even though dental decay was widespread, it rarely slowed people down, because expectations were low and life expectancy wasn't particularly high. If you lived to 35 and still had more than 4 teeth, you were practically a walking miracle, and bad breath, just part of the ambience. You could smell a knight before you saw his armor, and if he kissed you, well, let's just say romance was relative. So next time you're brushing your teeth with fluoride-enhanced mint gel while streaming a true crime podcast, spare a moment for our medieval ancestors. They fought plaque with fire ashes, wine and prayers. They didn't give up because they were lazy. They gave up because the alternatives were horrifying. And honestly, after a dead mouse tooth compress, you might have too. If you thought toothbrushes were only tools for hygiene, think again. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, they were also status symbols, fashion statements, and sometimes absurd displays of wealth. While the common folk were still rubbing their teeth with rags and ash or ignoring them entirely, Europe's elite were turning dental care into a gilded affair. Because when you're marching across continents, the last thing you want is battlefield breath. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, self-crowned emperor, and allegedly the proud owner of a gold-handled toothbrush. Yes, while the rest of Europe trembled under his military campaigns, Napoleon was out here brushing like royalty, because he was royalty, and apparently royalty don't settle for bamboo or bone when there's gold and badger bristles on the menu. Napoleon's grooming habits, like many aspects of his life, were surprisingly meticulous. His battlefield tactics may have been explosive, but his oral hygiene routine was downright calculated. According to records, he carried a personal grooming set wherever he went, including toothbrushes so finely crafted they could double as art pieces. In one documented case, his toothbrush had not only a gold handle but was engraved with his imperial insignia. You know, just in case someone mistook it for the general's soup spoon. But Napoleon wasn't alone in this. By the late 1700s, personalized toothbrushes had become a quiet obsession among the aristocracy. Kings, queens, dukes, duchesses, everyone wanted in. Handles were carved from ivory, mother of pearl, silver or tortoiseshell, sometimes set with jewels. You didn't just clean your teeth, you flexed your lineage while doing it. In many elite homes, toothbrushes were displayed like trophies in dressing rooms, arranged in gleaming cases like sacred relics of personal hygiene. Did they work well? Well, sort of. Most toothbrushes of the period used animal bristles, boar hair being the favorite. These were stiff, unyielding, and had a tendency to harbor bacteria. Not exactly the pinnacle of sanitary design, but again the emphasis was less on function and more on flaunting. If it gleamed in candlelight, it was good enough. Toothbrushes became a luxury item that served as conversation starters during elite gatherings. Imagine sitting at a dinner party in Paris, sipping Madeira, and casually mentioning, "My toothbrush was carved from narwhal tusk by a blind monk in Florence." Whether or not it cleaned your molars was beside the point. This obsession even extended to travel. Wealthy travelers often packed elaborate hygiene kits which included toothbrushes, scented tooth powders, tongue scrapers, and monogrammed linen napkins. These weren't just bathroom accessories, they were social armor. Having clean teeth signaled that you had the time, means, and servants to care about your mouth, which was basically the 18th century version of having a verified Instagram account. Meanwhile, royal households went a step further. Many had designated toothbrush holders, not to hold the brush, but the actual servant who handled it. That's right. Some nobles had a valet whose job included preparing their toothbrush each morning, applying the paste, and handing it over like it was a sacred object of war. And don't even ask who had to clean it afterwards. The actual dental powders of the time were often a mix of chalk, crushed seashells, burnt bread, and sometimes powdered charcoal, because why shouldn't your mouth taste like a shipwreck and a barbecue? But they were sold in fine containers, perfumed with rose or mint, and often came with instructions in elegant French cursive. Still, despite all the pomp, the results were mixed at best. Many elite smiles were yellowed or decayed, but hidden behind fans, mustaches, or the equally strategic dim lighting of candlelit salons. Dental visits were rare and dreaded, so a fancy toothbrush served as more of a preventive statement than an actual medical device. It told people, "I care about my mouth," even if your gums were secretly receding like a French army in winter. Interestingly, this period also marked the beginning of toothbrush gifting culture. Giving someone a brush carved from ivory with their initials was considered both intimate and tasteful, like giving a luxury watch, but more bristly. It was common among lovers, friends, and even political allies. One Russian noble reportedly gifted a toothbrush with emerald inlays to his mistress, because apparently nothing says "I adore you" like encouraging her to scrub her molars. By the dawn of the 19th century, toothbrushes were increasingly mass-produced, thanks in part to rising demand among the middle class. But among the upper crust, the gold standard literally remained. Even as Europe headed toward industrialization, toothbrushes stayed bougie, clinging to their place on the aristocratic vanity table like a stubborn bicuspid. So yes, Napoleon may have conquered empires, but he also conquered gingivitis with gilded flair. His enemies may have feared his cannons, but his allies probably just feared breakfast meetings. Because when your breath could conquer countries, but your brush had gold trim, you weren't just brushing teeth, you were brushing in style. Picture this. It's 1780, and you're stuck in a British jail. The food is questionable, the company worse, and dental hygiene is, well, non-existent. Most prisoners are busy plotting escape or quietly rotting, often both. But one man, William Addis, looked around his grimy cell, reflected on the state of his molars and thought, you know what would make this place better? A toothbrush. Yes, the modern toothbrush owes its origin not to a dentist or scientist, but to an inmate, a man who allegedly ended up in prison for starting a riot. So technically, he got locked up for running his mouth, only to change how the rest of the world cleaned theirs. Before Addis's light bulb moment, tooth cleaning in Britain was creative, if not exactly effective. People used soot, salt, crushed eggshells, or even their fingers. Tools ranged from chewed twigs to strips of cloth dipped in vinegar. If your gums bled, that just meant it was working, right? Wrong. But they didn't know that yet. Addis, however, had ideas. While languishing behind bars, he watched fellow prisoners rubbing dirty rags on their teeth and thought, there must be a better way. He saved a small animal bone from one of his meals, likely mutton, and with the help of a bristle brush, some say a broom used for sweeping the floors, he fashioned a crude but revolutionary tool, a handle with bristles designed solely for cleaning teeth, a stick you could actually hold, a brush with purpose. It may not sound revolutionary now, but back then it was like inventing the wheel but for mouths. Once released, Addis turned his jail cell invention into a business, a smart move after all. Toothbrushes couldn't be confiscated as weapons unless wielded very creatively, and demand was slowly growing among the hygiene-conscious upper and middle classes. His first models used cattle bone for the handle and boar bristles sewn into holes at the top. Each one was made by hand, and if you think threading bristles into bone sounds like the kind of job Victorian children were forced to do for pennies, you'd be right. Addis's idea snowballed. By the early 19th century, he was running a full-fledged toothbrush factory, employing dozens of workers. He didn't just create a new tool, he invented an industry. His brushes became popular among the growing middle class, who were eager to adopt the grooming habits of the aristocracy, but without the need for gold trim or monogram toothpaste jars. The company he founded, Addis & Sons, remained in operation for well over a century. In fact, the brand eventually evolved into Wisdom Toothbrushes, a company that still exists in the UK today. That's right, from a 1780 prison cell to your local drugstore shelf, Addis's legacy still lingers, probably fresher than the smell of the prison meal he got the idea from. Of course, early toothbrushes weren't exactly gentle. Boar bristles were stiff, scratchy, and about as friendly to your gums as a hedgehog, but they were seen as a major leap forward. They could actually clean the teeth, or at least smear the chalky powders around in style. More importantly, they could be manufactured, and that was the game changer. Toothbrushes were no longer luxury curiosities found in a royal vanity cabinet. They were products. Factories began churning out brushes in vast quantities. Materials were sourced, designs standardized, and soon toothbrushes became household items, not just aristocratic accessories. Handles remained bone for a time. Nothing says fresh breath like leftover cow femur, but eventually wood and early plastics like celluloid entered the scene. The genius of Addis wasn't just the brush, it was the brush business. He didn't patent his design, not uncommon at the time, but he did brand it. In a world where few had even seen a toothbrush, he made it both available and aspirational. A clean mouth was suddenly a symbol of self-respect, not just vanity. And while Addis himself likely didn't live to see the full brush boom of the industrial era, his impact was already unstoppable. By the Victorian period, brushing teeth once a day was being pushed by health reformers. By the 20th century, Dentists were declaring it a moral duty. And somewhere, in a dusty grave, Addis was probably grinning through his boar-brushed molars. So next time you're standing in your bathroom, absent-mindedly brushing while scrolling your phone, remember that simple act of oral upkeep was born from a jail cell, a bone, and a man who turned boredom into brilliance. Because William Addis didn't just serve his time, he served humanity. Jail time well spent, less teeth gnashing, more teeth brushing. Until 1938, brushing your teeth meant engaging in a ritual that was part grooming, part masochism. For centuries, the dominant tool was a stick with boar bristles, a hygiene horror show if ever there was one. These stiff, wiry hairs weren't exactly gentle. If you've ever had the pleasure of brushing your teeth with what felt like a hay bale dipped in vinegar, congratulations, you've had the authentic pre-nylon experience. And while boar bristles were popular, read all there was, they came with charming side effects like splintered gums, foul breath, and unwanted barnyard nostalgia. Plus, they weren't exactly hygienic. The porous nature of natural bristles meant they could trap bacteria, rot over time, and basically serve as petri dishes on sticks. But then came 1938, the year your toothbrush got a science upgrade. Enter DuPont, the chemical powerhouse behind everything from gunpowder to fake silk. In the late 1930s, they introduced a marvel of modern chemistry, nylon, the world's first fully synthetic fiber. Originally intended to replace silk in stockings, it quickly found another, less glamorous but far more enduring application: toothbrush bristles. That year, the Dr. West's Miracle Tuft toothbrush hit the market. It was the first toothbrush ever to use nylon instead of animal hair, and it did for oral hygiene what sliced bread did for sandwiches. It was cleaner, smoother, longer lasting, and most importantly, free of anything that once lived on a farm. For the first time, people could brush without the constant worry that their toothbrush might start to smell like wet hog after a week of use. Nylon was non-absorbent, flexible, and miraculously inexpensive to produce. It was everything a boar bristle wasn't, especially dead. Of course, not everyone was immediately on board. Some traditionalists clung to their trusty animal bristles with the kind of devotion usually reserved for family heirlooms or roast dinner recipes. But the advantages of nylon were hard to ignore. Dentists began recommending it. Ads showed smiling families brushing in sparkly white-tiled bathrooms. Nylon had arrived, and the era of livestock-based hygiene was circling the drain. But nylon didn't just change the bristles, it revolutionized everything about the toothbrush. Once freed from the limitations of hand-drilled bone or carved wood, manufacturers could start experimenting with new handle shapes, textures, and colors. The toothbrush entered the age of mass customization, where handles were curved for ergonomic grip, and bristles were arranged in rows like tiny dental battalions. Suddenly, dental care wasn't just a necessity, it was a consumer choice. Did you want medium or soft bristles? Flat head or contoured? Red, green, or that curious aqua blue that no one seems to buy but still exists for some reason? And let's talk about sanitation. With nylon, brushes dried faster and didn't harbor bacteria the same way natural bristles did. They could be rinsed clean without the smell of something that had been dragged through a pig pen. Dentists began touting nylon as more hygienic, and the American Dental Association ADA, notoriously slow to agree on anything, gave its glowing approval. By the 1940s and 50s, nylon bristled brushes were the norm in the US and spreading worldwide. Mass production made them affordable and available, and by the time Elvis was swiveling his hips, Americans were finally brushing their teeth like it was a patriotic duty. And yes, even toothbrush aesthetics were having a moment. The 1960s and 70s brought innovation in color coding for family members, travel caps, and eventually the explosion of cartoon-themed brushes for kids, because nothing says dental compliance like a bristle-wielding Bugs Bunny. Behind all of this was one simple truth: synthetics had saved our gums. No longer did oral care mean brushing with something that previously rooted through the dirt. With nylon, brushing became less about survival and more about sparkle. And while we might take it for granted now, The leap from animal to plastic was monumental. Nylon laid the foundation for further innovations: soft bristles, angled heads, gum massagers, tongue scrubbers, and eventually the all-singing, all-vibrating electric toothbrush. But at its core, that 1938 breakthrough did something far greater. It democratized dental care. Nylon bristles allowed toothbrushes to be cheap, clean, and made in the millions. Suddenly, everyone from coal miners to corporate executives could own one, and their mouths were better for it. So next time you're mindlessly brushing while checking your hair in the mirror, spare a thought for that squeaky clean fiber that made it all possible. Because thanks to nylon, we no longer brush with something that once squealed. Finally, brushing without the barnyard aftertaste. If you had to pick one global conflict that improved dental hygiene, World War II might not be your first guess. But amid the bombs, blackouts, and ration books, another battle was quietly unfolding, one fought with toothbrushes, toothpaste, and a healthy dose of military-grade peer pressure. By the 1940s, oral hygiene in the US wasn't exactly stellar. Cavities were common, gum disease was rampant, and many Americans treated brushing like flossing today, something they knew they should do but probably wouldn't. Sure, nylon bristles had arrived a few years earlier, but widespread dental discipline? Not so much. Then came Uncle Sam, armed with rifles, rations, and a brand new hygiene mandate. All US military personnel were required to brush their teeth daily. Yes, even in foxholes. Why the sudden obsession with oral care? Simple. The military had a manpower problem, and that problem included teeth. During World War I, poor dental health had rendered a shocking number of draftees unfit for service. Rotten molars and infected gums had disqualified would-be soldiers by the tens of thousands. By World War I, the army had learned its lesson: you can't win wars with toothaches. So brushing became military protocol, right alongside clean uniforms and shiny boots. Soldiers were issued government-approved toothbrushes and toothpaste as part of their standard kits. Dental care wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Army dentists gave checkups, filled cavities, pulled problematic teeth, and handed out advice with all the gentleness of a drill sergeant. And guess what? It worked. The habit stuck. Men who'd never touched a toothbrush before the war were now brushing daily out of routine, if not exactly joy. And when they came home after the war, they brought that routine with them, along with war stories, ration recipes, and suspiciously acquired German silverware. In post-war America, brushing exploded into the mainstream. The returning GIs had been trained to care about their teeth, and now they expected their families to do the same. The toothbrush became a fixture in every bathroom, no longer a luxury or a weirdly personal gift from the dentist. And the military didn't just shape habits, it shaped the message. Public health campaigns followed the war's example, adopting language that felt almost patriotic. Brushing your teeth became part of being a responsible citizen. It was clean, it was modern, it was the American way. Ads from the late 1940s and early 1950s painted brushing as the key to success, confidence, and even romance. Want to land a job? Brush. Want to land a spouse? Brush harder. Want to fight communism with minty fresh breath? Brush twice daily and rinse with pride. Toothbrush companies didn't waste the opportunity. They rolled out models with military precision, promoted by slogans like "Battle Tooth Decay" and "Guard Your Smile." The GI brush, modeled after the standard issue Army toothbrush, even became a commercial product. Meanwhile, schools started teaching kids how to brush properly, often with terrifying cartoon germs and cheerful songs about gingivitis. Fluoride began to be added to drinking water. Dental hygiene was no longer just a private matter, it was a national mission, and it wasn't just about teeth. Oral health was tied to broader ideas of strength, cleanliness, and moral character. A clean mouth meant discipline, it meant order, it meant you probably didn't spend your paycheck on soda and pipe tobacco. It also meant profit. Toothpaste companies saw a post-war boom like no other. With a captive audience freshly trained in dental diligence, the market exploded. The post-war economy loved a good product. And toothpaste, with its patriotic packaging, science-y claims and minty reassurance, was now a household staple. Tubes flew off the shelves faster than hot dogs on the 4th of July. This all laid the foundation for the modern dental industry. From that single military directive came generations of Americans who grew up thinking that brushing your teeth wasn't just a good idea, it was a requirement of adulthood, somewhere between filing taxes and pretending to like broccoli. And let's not forget the global impact. American soldiers stationed abroad during the war brought their hygiene habits with them, influencing local populations. The toothbrush became as recognizable an export as Coca-Cola or jazz. So the next time you sigh and stumble toward the sink at midnight, toothpaste cap in one hand and blurry regret in the other, remember this: you're not just brushing your teeth, you're honoring decades of government-mandated molar maintenance. Because when the world went to war, tooth decay lost. By the mid-20th century, dental hygiene had officially crossed over from daily duty to consumer goldmine. Gone were the days of brushing out of obligation. Now, you brushed for sex appeal. You brushed for your career. You brushed because the television told you to. Welcome to the golden age of marketing, a time when toothpaste wasn't just toothpaste, it was a lifestyle. And nothing sold that lifestyle better than an advertising campaign with too much confidence and way too much mint. The post-war boom brought not only money, baby strollers and drive-in diners, it also brought television sets into American living rooms. Suddenly, advertisers had a direct line to the eyeballs and molars of the masses, and they didn't waste it. Commercials didn't just suggest you brush your teeth. They made it sound like skipping a morning scrub would cause you to die alone, unemployed, and smelling faintly of regret. And toothpaste, oh, it got personality. Brands emerged with swagger: Colgate, Crest, Pepsodent, all claiming to offer the cleanest, whitest, most romantically viable smile in the nation. Each promised a magical blend of science and sparkle, often backed by 9 out of 10 dentists who were apparently moonlighting as commercial actors. They didn't just want to clean your teeth, they wanted to sell you confidence. One of the biggest turning points in this minty marketing blitz was fluoride. Once a quiet element on the periodic table, fluoride was suddenly the Beyoncé of oral care. After being added to municipal water supplies, it was rapidly embraced by toothpaste companies who used it as a scientific battering ram against cavities. Now your toothpaste didn't just clean, it protected, strengthened, and made dentists proud. It didn't take long for advertisers to go full sci-fi. Commercials featured animated cavities being zapped away by smiling fluoride molecules. A single brushstroke became an act of heroism. The cavity was the enemy. Toothpaste was your weapon. And you were the clean-breathed savior of suburbia. Celebrity endorsements added another layer of sparkle. Toothpaste ads began featuring TV stars, singers, and the occasional astronaut, because if it's good enough for space, it's good enough for Kansas. These weren't just clean teeth, they were famous clean teeth. Meanwhile, toothbrushes were getting their own glow-up. If the brush you used didn't look like it had emerged from a NASA lab, were you even trying? Curved handles, flexible necks, multicolored bristles, every new design promised better reach, deeper clean, and possibly the key to eternal youth. Did you need a rubberized grip with 32 precision cleaning tufts? No, but you bought it anyway, because it had a diagram on the box. And then came the electric toothbrush, first invented in the late 1950s and entering homes with a confident buzz. It promised to do everything your sad little manual brush couldn't. Why scrub like a peasant, it implied, when you could vibrate like royalty? Some models even had timers, pressure sensors, and futuristic charging stations that made your bathroom counter look like a Bond villain's lair. Of course, not everyone embraced the new tech. Some found the vibrations jarring, others worried about accidentally brushing off their gums. But most people, they were dazzled. Because nothing says modern hygiene quite like a device that makes your mouth feel like it's been gently power washed. As the decades rolled on, the perfect smile became less about health and more about optics. Whitening strips, blue light gadgets, charcoal toothpaste, products multiplied, all promising blinding brilliance and eternal youth. And if none of it worked, you could always get veneers and pretend. The marketing kept pace, evolving with the times. In the 1980s, toothpaste ads leaned into romance and charisma. If your breath isn't inviting, your date won't be either. In the 1990s, it was all about bright smiles in bright offices. Climb the corporate ladder, one minty breath at a time. By the 2000s, it became about self-care, wellness, and Instagrammable packaging. Toothpaste got rebranded as oral beauty, all of it. Every jingle, every sparkly swirl, every gleaming celebrity incisor led to one thing: a nation deeply emotionally invested in toothpaste. Brushing was no longer a dull chore. It was a ritual, an identity, a consumer experience. And let's be honest, somewhere deep down, brushing to a commercial jingle did feel cleaner. Somehow a minty swish set to upbeat music made you feel like you'd done something meaningful before breakfast. So the next time you squeeze that designer paste onto a neon-bristled ergonomic brush while humming a toothpaste ad from 1997, remember, you're not just cleaning your teeth, you're honoring a long tradition of commercially motivated mouthwash morality. Because brushing your teeth? That's not just self-care. That's brand loyalty. We did it. We reached the toothbrush endgame. After centuries of chewing sticks, bone handles, and a brief love affair with radioactive toothpaste, humanity has entered the modern dental age, an era where your toothbrush not only vibrates, it judges you. It records your strokes, reports your brushing habits to your smartphone, and probably mutters passive-aggressively when you skip flossing again. Welcome to the oral arms race, where brushing your teeth is now a tech-driven experience with Wi-Fi connectivity and guilt in high definition. At the heart of this movement is the smart toothbrush, a device that comes loaded with sensors, timers, and enough artificial intelligence to make you question your life choices. It doesn't just clean your teeth, it creates heat maps of your mouth, scores you on your brushing technique, and sends gentle reminders like, "You missed your back molars again. Do you even care about plaque?" Some even connect with apps that cheer you on like a dental Fitbit. "Great job brushing this morning," the app chirps. It's a nice sentiment until you realize you're being congratulated by your toothbrush more often than your boss. Naturally, these smart brushes aren't content with simply improving your dental hygiene. No, they aim to gamify your gums. Some models offer brushing games, smile challenges, and interactive feedback. Suddenly, tooth care has become a competitive sport. High scores aren't just for video games anymore, they're for plaque removal. But amid the tech frenzy, a different concern has bubbled to the surface: the environment. Turns out, our quest for oral excellence has left a less than fresh footprint. Billions of plastic toothbrushes end up in landfills every year. That's right, while you're proudly brushing your way to dental nirvana, your old toothbrush is out there, chilling for eternity, in a pile of decomposing flip-flops and yogurt lids. Eco-conscious brands have responded with green alternatives: bamboo toothbrushes, compostable handles, refillable heads. Some even boast vegan bristles, because nothing screams moral purity like brushing with ethically sourced fibers. These brushes offer the same minty mission without the plastic shame spiral. But even they come with trade-offs: shorter lifespans, limited bristle styles, and the distinct feeling that your toothbrush might dissolve if it gets too wet. And then there's the luxury toothbrush scene, which exists, somehow, in a world where oral hygiene has gone fully haute couture. We're talking gold-plated handles, brushes that come in velvet-lined boxes, and designer dental sets that cost more than a semester of community college. There are even toothbrushes sold in spa gift boxes, because apparently your molars deserve to be pampered. For those less interested in brushing and more interested in brushing history, there are toothbrush museums, real ones, with exhibits dedicated to the evolution of bristles, early 20th century dental ads, and terrifying relics like powdered tooth polish and wooden toothbrushes that look more like weapons. The most passionate among them even host forums, talks, and online communities where fans can compare rare toothbrush finds like medieval coin collectors with better breath. As we look toward the future of brushing, The possibilities are equal parts thrilling and absurd. Imagine toothbrushes that sync with your DNA, customizing bristle stiffness based on your ancestral enamel patterns, or ones that talk to your fridge, warning you when your dairy intake has surpassed optimal calcium absorption. Or maybe they'll be implanted in your mouth, silently buzzing like tiny janitors every few hours. And yet, with all this innovation, with all the progress we've made from pig bristles to Bluetooth, one thing remains hilariously true. We still forget to floss. We brush with cutting-edge technology. We polish our smiles with celebrity-endorsed pastes. We scan our molars with digital apps that track enamel erosion. But flossing, that's still sitting untouched in the back of the bathroom drawer, waiting patiently for us to remember it exists once every 6 months right before the dentist appointment. Because no matter how futuristic toothbrushes become, we're still human. Lazy, distracted, always running late humans, and no smart device has yet managed to override the deeply ingrained instinct to say, yes, of course I floss daily, while making vague eye contact with the ceiling. Still, the evolution of the toothbrush is a testament to something oddly hopeful. It shows that even the most mundane object, something you put in your mouth half asleep at 7 a.m., can become a symbol of innovation, culture, and the weird intersection of guilt and marketing. So next time you pick up your sleek, vibrating, Bluetooth-enabled oral companion, remember, you're not just brushing, you're participating in a centuries-long, ever-expanding saga of dental ambition, eco-panic, and consumer tech wizardry, and maybe, just maybe, you'll even remember to floss. If you were poor, desperate, and breathing in Victorian Britain, congratulations, you just qualified for a job in domestic service. And don't worry about a resume. No one cared about your hobbies or career aspirations. The only real requirement was the ability to survive long hours, constant humiliation, and the mysterious stains that came with the job. Oh, and good teeth. Victorians were weirdly obsessed with those. Domestic service wasn't just an industry. It was the industry. By the mid-1800s, about 1 in 3 women under 25 were employed in someone else's home, cooking meals they weren't allowed to eat, ironing clothes they weren't allowed to wear, and scrubbing floors they weren't allowed to walk on without permission. It was like living inside someone else's life, only with more soap and less sleep. So where did these servants come from? Most were pulled from the rural working class, often plucked from villages like unwanted weeds. Imagine being a 13-year-old farm girl, suddenly told you're going to London to make something of yourself, only to discover that something is scrubbing soot out of fireplaces and being yelled at by a lady who thinks butter just magically appears. Others were orphans, which, in Victorian England, was less tragic backstory and more employment funnel. Foundlings were often funneled straight from orphanages into service, sometimes with the sort of cheery pep talk that included, "It builds character, and you only have to work for the next 40 years. Still more were daughters of downwardly mobile families, farmers who had too many mouths to feed and not enough pigs to sell. These girls were encouraged, shoved into service because at least it meant one fewer child at the dinner table. Bonus, the employer might even feed them. Occasionally, maybe. Now, before you imagine some formal job interview with a firm handshake and thoughtful questions, stop. This wasn't LinkedIn. This was more like livestock auction, human edition. A prospective employer might look you up and down like a particularly underwhelming cabbage and ask things like, have you experience with copper polishing? Do you faint easily? Are you of a silent and obedient nature? And just like that, you might be hired, or dismissed, or told to come back in a week with cleaner shoes and a less pitiful face. If you passed the visual inspection, which often meant having a sturdy frame, decent posture, and a face that didn't scream rebellion, you might land a position in the grand hierarchy of servanthood. This hierarchy was as rigid as a starched collar and just as uncomfortable. Let's break it down. The butler, the king of the downstairs kingdom. He guarded the wine cellar like a dragon and carried the house keys with all the swagger of a man who knew where every single fork was supposed to go. The housekeeper, a formidable figure who ran the female staff with military precision and could cut through nonsense with a single glare. Part mother, part manager, part prison warden, footman, the eye candy of the household, chosen for height, looks, and the ability to wear livery without tripping over it. Duties included opening doors dramatically and existing for aesthetic purposes. Parlour maids kept the fancy rooms fancy and poured tea with the grace of a swan and the emotional availability of a stone. Cooks, feared and revered, controlled the kitchen like a culinary warlord and could make or break your day depending on whether you stepped too close to the pantry. Scullery maids, the absolute bottom rung. Their hands lived in dishwater, their hair lived under a mop cap, and their souls lived in constant despair. If a job was horrible, wet, or involved something mysterious and smelly, it was the scullery maid's job. For male servants, footmen and butlers were the prestige roles. For women, being a lady's maid was the golden goose, especially if the lady travelled and brought you along. If you were really lucky, you got to see Paris. If you weren't, you saw a lot of chamber pots. And let's not forget the importance of references. One bad letter from a previous employer, say, suggesting you had a lazy gait, or overheard conversations beyond your station, and you might as well start applying to be a chimney sweep. Spoiler, you didn't want to be a chimney sweep. The worst part, these jobs were fought over. Competition was fierce, because as soul-sucking as they were better than the workhouse, the street, or the early grave waiting for many poor Victorians. At least in service, you had food, kind of, shelter, damp, and the chance to wear a uniform that made you look mildly like a chess piece. So yes, congratulations, you've got the job. You've passed the inspection, received your uniform, and you're ready to start your life in domestic service. All you have to do now is forget what happiness feels like, and accept that for the next several decades, your name will be girl, your opinion will be illegal, and your dreams will be carefully ironed out alongside the linens. Welcome to 19th century hospitality. You may now begin losing your will to live. If you're someone who hits snooze 5 times before facing the horror of a Monday morning, then congratulations, you already wouldn't have made it as a Victorian servant, because in the 19th century your day didn't begin when the sun rose. It began before the sun even considered it. For most domestic servants, 5 a.m. was considered a lazy start. If you were a scullery maid or hall boy, you were expected to be out of bed by 4:30 a.m., if not earlier, blinking blearily into the gaslight and wondering why your pillow smells vaguely of potatoes. Spoiler, because you were sleeping in the pantry. The first sound you heard wasn't birdsong or a gentle alarm. It was probably a bell, a bang, or a barked order from someone already cranky and halfway through their day. If you had the luxury of sleeping indoors, it was likely in a cramped attic room with sloped ceilings and no insulation. If you were really lucky, the roof only leaked on one side. Your first task? Lighting the fires. All of them. The Victorian home ran on a delicate ecosystem of open flames and ash, fireplaces in every room, coal stoves in the kitchen, and no central heating to speak of. If you weren't careful, you'd end up singeing your eyebrows, setting your apron alight, or inhaling enough soot to permanently alter your lung capacity. Which was fine, because air quality wasn't a priority anyway. Every fireplace had to be emptied of its ash, then carefully rebuilt with kindling, coal, and what little remained of your optimism. Dozens of fireplaces meant dozens of early morning sprints with a coal scuttle, and matches that refused to cooperate. And all this needed to be done before the family so much as wriggled a toe under their monogrammed duvets. Next, water. Victorians loved water. They just didn't want to fetch it. That's where you came in. Carrying buckets of it up multiple flights of stairs was your new morning cardio. Hot water? Even worse. That had to be boiled on the stove, then carefully schlepped upstairs, all without spilling or scalding yourself, because nothing ruins a silk carpet like first-degree burns. Then came boots and shoes. You didn't just place them out, you polished them to within an inch of their leather lives, and not just any polish. The kind that required elbow grease, a rag, and enough focus to make each pair glimmer like a royal mirror. There were separate brushes for blacking and buffing, and if you used the wrong one, prepare for war. The doorknobs? Polished. The stair rails? Polished. Your hope for the future? Not so much. Let's not forget the importance of curtains. Those velvet monstrosities had to be drawn open at precisely the right angle, lest the room feel off when the lady of the house waltzed in with her teacup and disdain. Same with opening windows. You needed to create a pleasant breeze, but not a draft. A draft meant a cold. A cold meant complaints. Complaints meant you'd be back on water fetching duty all week. Now, if you're thinking, surely there was a break after this frenzy, then no, and how dare you ask? Breakfast had to be prepared, trays assembled, beds made, nightclothes folded, letters fetched from the postboy, dogs walked, rugs beaten, and anything that could be dusted, dusted aggressively. In fact, if you weren't actively moving at all times, you were assumed to be slacking, or worse, plotting sedition. And here's the real kicker: none of this was your main job. These were preliminary tasks, the appetizer before the 12-course banquet of labor that made up the rest of your day. You were simply setting the stage for your actual duties, which would involve even more scrubbing, serving, sorting, lifting, and being invisible in the presence of anyone with a title longer than 2 syllables. Also, a quick note on weekends: they didn't exist, at least not for you. Sunday, the Lord's Day of Rest, meant polishing the church pews before your employer's arrival and preparing extra tea cakes afterward. Your day off, if granted, might be once a month, and it usually involved being allowed to walk around the block for half an hour, escorted, just in case you got any ideas about freedom. Naps were mythical, sitting down was suspicious, and yawning was practically treason. If you found yourself exhausted by 10 a.m., you still had another 14 hours to go. Meals were served, dinner clothes laid out, laundry boiled, tables reset, and fires kept burning until the household went to bed. Only once the last light went out upstairs could you maybe sneak a few hours of sleep, assuming you weren't summoned again because someone's cat needed fluffing. So yes, waking up at 4:30 to begin a silent, soot-filled sprint through a Victorian house wasn't just a morning routine. It was a survival ritual. A carefully orchestrated ballet of sweat, soot, and sighs, all performed in silence lest you be caught acknowledging your own existence. If you thought waking up early was bad, try being up before the rooster, just to clean his coop. You've been hired, woken before time itself, and survived your first round of Victorian chaos. Congratulations, you're now ready to perform tasks so peculiar, humiliating, or soul-crushing they make coal scuttle refilling seem glamorous. Welcome to the job you never applied for properly and definitely didn't get to negotiate. Because if you thought domestic service was just about dusting shelves and pouring tea, then oh sweet summer child, you are not prepared. Let's begin with the absurdities. First, ironing newspapers. Victorians were terrified of germs, creases, and heaven forbid, ink smudges. Newspapers were pressed with hot irons to dry the ink, flatten the pages, and essentially sanitize the opinions. You, the servant, had to do this without scorching the editorial section or accidentally branding Queen Victoria's face into the society column. Then there was toilet seat warming. Since bathrooms were often chilly enough to see your breath, servants were dispatched ahead of nature's call to sit, yes sit, on the lavatory for several minutes to ensure their employer's rear end never encountered discomfort. You were essentially a human seat heater. No plaque, no recognition, just a very warm seat and the quiet knowledge that your thighs were a battleground in the war against chilly buttocks. And if that wasn't humiliating enough, there's dandruff brushing. Picture this: you're gently removing dead scalp snowflakes from your employer's jacket before a dinner party, all while making absolutely sure you don't make eye contact, breathe too loudly, or let a single flake hit the polished floor. And if anyone asks what you're doing, you're presenting the coat, elegance and hygiene, delicately mixed. But the odd jobs were just the beginning. Far worse was the art of invisibility. Servants weren't simply expected to be efficient. They were expected to be non-existent until summoned. The goal was to move with ninja-like stealth, complete tasks in complete silence, and evaporate before the gentry remembered you were real. This unspoken rule was called the servant's veil, not something you wore, but rather the socially constructed boundary that meant you didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, only in the most hushed, apologetic tones, preferably while backing out of the room like a guilty fog. Your whole existence revolved around timing your presence so perfectly that your employer could live under the illusion that meals appeared on their own, rooms cleaned themselves, and slippers walked into position through divine intervention. It was like being a magician, but instead of applause, you got a nod of vague disapproval, and possibly a scolding for standing on the left side of the hallway instead of the right. Now here's where it gets cruelly delightful. Even when you performed your job flawlessly, your future still depended on the reference letter. One tiny mistake, and your whole career could unravel faster than the hem on Lady Agatha's second-best evening gown. If your letter lacked the sacred word excellent, it might as well have said untrustworthy pickpocket with questionable morals and bad porridge stirring technique. Let's break that down. Excellent meant you were competent, clean, and unlikely to cause embarrassment. Good meant you had probably spilled something on someone important at some point. Satisfactory meant you were walking career roadkill. And no letter at all. You were as good as unemployable, unless you fancied pretending to be a chimney sweep and getting stuck in a flue forever. Mistakes were not tolerated. Dropped a tray, that's a week of silent disapproval and floor scrubbing. Served tea with the milk before the water, social death for them and professional death for you. Accidentally witnessed a private family argument while clearing a vase. Expect to be reassigned to coal duty for the foreseeable future. Even sighing audibly in the presence of a guest could result in a conversation, which in Victorian terms meant being told, calmly and firmly, that your attitude reflected poorly on the drapes. And heaven help you if you broke something valuable. You wouldn't just be punished, you'd be forced to stand there as the object was mourned more deeply than any dead relative. A shattered teacup, that was a family heirloom. A cracked mirror, a superstition-laden disaster. A chipped plate, you just offended generations of fine china. Yet despite all this, servants were expected to be cheerful, or at least appear to be. You were meant to smile softly at nothing, carry yourself with quiet grace, and speak only when your vocal cords had been given permission by the housekeeper. Think ballet dancer meets ghost with a dash of unpaid therapist and janitor. And so there you were, handling chamber pots at 6 a.m., ironing editorial commentary by 7, brushing dandruff by 9, and vanishing entirely by 10. You were a professional in every sense except payment, rights, or acknowledgement. A magician, but sadder, poorer, and always one mistake away from the almshouse. If you wanted to exist, you did it behind the scenes. If you wanted to complain, you did it in whispers behind the scullery door. And if you ever dared to hope for anything more than a warm bowl of leftover soup and a letter with the word excellent, then congratulations, you were officially the most dangerous kind of servant, one with dreams. Victorian homes weren't just houses, they were stratified social ecosystems, carefully designed to make sure the rich never had to encounter anyone who reminded them that mutton doesn't roast itself. The architecture reflected the social hierarchy. The grand staircase was for swanning, the back stairs were for sweating, and servants naturally lived and worked somewhere between the chimney flue and emotional exhaustion. To understand this, you must first picture a typical Victorian townhouse, opulent drawing rooms, dripping in velvet, chandeliers the size of livestock, and furniture so heavily carved it looked like it had survived a bar fight at Versailles. Upstairs was the world of luxury. It was clean, bright, and smelled faintly of potpourri and aristocratic self-satisfaction. Downstairs, welcome to the mushroom kingdom, damp, dim, and smelling faintly of boiled despair. Servants' quarters were often tucked in the basement or the attic, depending on which part of the house the architect hated more. Either way, you were guaranteed a view of exactly nothing, a ceiling you could knock your head on, and a mattress that probably doubled as mouse housing. The upstairs-downstairs divide wasn't just about physical space, it was a metaphysical barrier. You existed within the house but not of the house. The drawing room was the holy of holies, and you, the lowly servant, were not worthy to breathe in its parquet-floored glory unless you were delivering tea, dusting the piano, or fetching a handkerchief with the urgency of a medical emergency. And how did they summon you? No shouting. Heavens no, that would be uncouth. Instead, the Victorian elite installed a system of bells and buzzers that connected nearly every room to the servant quarters like a web of neediness. Each bell was tied to a particular room and mounted on a board downstairs with a tiny label: library, master's dressing room, conservatory, Lady Harrow's personal solitude nook, etc. When a bell rang, it didn't just ding, it demanded. The sharp clang of brass against wood echoed through the servants' halls like the voice of an angry god. You were expected to know exactly where it came from, who was likely ringing it, and what they might want, all in under 30 seconds. A delay could result in a passive-aggressive silence from the master of the house, which somehow felt worse than actual yelling. Some of the more modern households, i.e. those run by people with a strong affection for both science and subtle tyranny, upgraded to electrical buzzer systems. These were basically 19th century doorbells wired throughout the home, and yes, they were absolutely abused. Think of them as an aristocratic panic button: 1 buzz for tea, 2 buzzes for crumpets, 3 for why haven't you already anticipated my every emotional and dietary need. This led to an unavoidable truth about life as a servant. You were always moving, running up and down multiple flights of stairs, often with hot liquids, trays of fine china, or fragile egos in tow. You had to be quick, quiet, and balanced like a Victorian ninja with calluses. Some houses had up to 4 floors and a basement, with servants expected to dart between them like caffeinated squirrels. There were no elevators unless you counted the dumbwaiter, which only carried food, not people. Though one suspects many servants fantasized about crawling inside and escaping to freedom. And the stairs, they weren't your modern carpeted delights. These were narrow, steep, and so creaky they could be used as lie detectors. You learned to ascend them in absolute silence, a skill honed through repetition, fear, and the knowledge that Lady Brambleton didn't like to be startled while adjusting her corset. The physical effects of this stairmaster existence were real. Servants often developed immense leg strength simply from hauling coal, kettles, and complaints up and down all day. Forget gyms. This was the original CrossFit. You got cardio from errands, strength training from laundry baskets, and agility practice from dodging the housekeeper's glare. In fact, seasoned servants developed what can only be described as a sixth sense, not for danger, ghosts, or paranormal whispers, but for aristocratic whim. You'd be elbow deep in silver polish and suddenly know that someone upstairs was about to ring for a forgotten fan or a misplaced monocle. It was like Spidey sense, but instead of fighting crime, you were fighting crumbs on a damask tablecloth. This relentless running also meant servants learned the shortcuts and secret routes of the house. The narrow side staircases, the hidden service doors, the passages behind the bookcases that allowed you to appear in a room like a helpful spectre. You weren't just fast, you were strategically fast, like a rat in a maze, only with a tea tray and bad shoes. But the greatest tragedy? You did all this to maintain the illusion that life upstairs was effortless. That tea poured itself, fires lit themselves, and food just happened onto plates. Your presence was crucial, and yet entirely concealed. You were the gears in the pocket watch, intricate, tireless, and only noticed when something broke. So yes, in the grand Victorian household, you didn't just serve, you sprinted, squatted, climbed, and crouched your way into a state of muscular exhaustion while being emotionally invisible. You developed thighs of steel, lungs of soot, and a sixth sense for when someone upstairs needed a napkin. Welcome to the middle of the house and the bottom of the ladder. If you think setting the dinner table is as simple as tossing down some cutlery and shouting, "Let's eat," then congratulations, you are not a Victorian servant. Because in a 19th century upper-class household, dinner wasn't just dinner, it was the event. A multi-course, silver-polished, etiquette-obsessed opera of food, manners, and the crushing weight of silent judgment. And you, dear servant, were the understudy who never got to take a bow, only to pray you didn't trip and fall headfirst into the consommé. Let's start with the fact that serving a Victorian dinner was closer to conducting a symphony than putting food on plates. There was a rigid choreography involved. Servants glided in and out of the dining room in perfect synchronization, each holding trays, tureens, wine bottles or candelabras, hopefully not all at once. Each guest expected to be served in a particular order, and if you placed the fish knife before the oyster fork, you might as well pack your bags. 12 forks, 8 knives, and 6 types of spoons weren't just excess, they were code. 1 fork out of alignment? Scandal. Soup served before the consommé? Catastrophe. And God help you if you brought the port before the Madeira. There was a sequence to everything, and deviating from it wasn't just a mistake, it was culinary heresy. You'd think it would be easier if people just helped themselves. But no. This was service à la Russe, a style imported from Imperial Russia where servants served each course individually. So instead of laying all the food out at once like a glorious buffet, you brought out dish by dish, portion by portion, until your feet screamed and your arms went numb from balancing silver platters. Behind every flawless dinner service was a raging kitchen drama hotter than the soup tureen. The cook, often a terrifying woman wielding both cleaver and attitude, ran the kitchen like a dictator in an apron. The butler, lord of the dining room, believed he was above kitchen politics. The result? Passive-aggressive tension so thick it could be sliced and served for dessert. The butler wanted the roast at 8 sharp. The cook decided it would be 8:07 and good luck changing her mind. Servants got caught in the crossfire, usually the footmen, who were treated like disposable messenger pigeons in waistcoats. And speaking of footmen, their job during meals was essentially to float gracefully around the dining room, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, and somehow not breathing too loudly. Imagine ballet, but with fewer tights and more gravy. Let's talk about the true villain of the Victorian dinner table, the gravy boat, a deceptively innocent-looking object that could end your career faster than you could say beef dripping. One wrong tilt and you were wearing Sunday's roast on your apron, or worse, the guest's evening gloves. And let's just say the Victorians weren't known for forgiving fashion crimes. Wine service wasn't any kinder. You had to uncork bottles without a sound, no pop, no hiss, just silence and finesse. If you sloshed while pouring, you risked a scandal. If the label wasn't facing the guest, utter disgrace. If you dared to offer red with fish, congratulations, you've committed social murder. The pressure was relentless. You didn't just serve drinks, you presented them with the reverence of a sacred relic. Each bottle was inspected, decanted, and offered like an olive branch from one aristocratic ego to another. After hours of perilous service and soul-shrinking silence, you'd think there'd be a feast waiting for the staff downstairs. Not quite. If you were lucky, and if the guests weren't gluttons, you might be allowed to nibble on the scraps. Cold meat, wilted vegetables, half-dunked puddings, and don't think you had time to sit and savor. Dinner for the servants was more like a relay race, as you rushed to eat before being summoned to scrub the silverware, mop the floors, or find the missing soup spoon that Lady Wilhelmina swore was polished improperly. Oh, and about those spoons, you weren't just polishing them, you were polishing them with vinegar, chalk powder and elbow grease until you could see your future in the reflection, which, to be fair, was probably more silverware. Perhaps the cruelest rule of all was that servants had to remain expressionless throughout the entire affair. No smiling, no reacting, and certainly no making eye contact with the guests, who often behaved like toddlers with titles. When Lord Featherstone dropped his napkin and barked at you as if you'd stolen his horse, you had to bow, apologize, and retrieve it with the dignity of a diplomat retrieving a treaty. And when Lady Cornelia made a joke about how the lower classes always smell of cabbage, you had to stand there and smile with your insides screaming in Edwardian English. By the time the cheeses were rolled out and the brandy was poured, you weren't just tired, you were spiritually hollow. Your back ached, your shoes pinched, and you could still smell gravy in your hair. But you didn't complain. You couldn't, because tomorrow there'd be another dinner, another orchestration of forks and facial expressions, and you, you'd be there again, steady, silent, and praying no one ordered soup. Because if they did, you already knew the gravy boat was watching, and it held a grudge. Let's begin with a question. Have you ever looked at a chandelier and thought, you know what this needs? A full-body bath using a rag, vinegar, and unspoken trauma. If not, congratulations, you were not a Victorian servant. Victorian homes were, by all appearances, beautiful, stately, opulent, but beneath the marble mantels and mahogany staircases was a very different truth. These houses were essentially ornate dust magnets, wearing fancy hats. Every gilded picture frame, tufted chair, and decorative cornice was a declaration of wealth, and also a declaration of war against anyone tasked with keeping it clean. Let's talk about dust. You'd think dust would be the least of your problems in a house, but in the Victorian era, it was practically a sentient being. It floated in on shoes, horses, coal smoke, industrial pollution, and probably sheer spite. Combine that with an obsessive love for dark drapes, carved surfaces, and bric-a-brac galore, and you've got yourself a full-time job wiping down things that serve no function but to sit there and gather more dust. Curtains the size of ship sails had to be shaken out or beaten, and carpets were either nailed to the floor or glued down, which meant if you wanted them clean, you had to clean them in place. No vacuum, of course. Just brushes, brooms, a strong back, and the existential dread of a week-long cleaning marathon. Victorian cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was a performance. Your employer's silver must gleam bright enough to blind guests. Floors had to reflect the chandelier above them like a mirror, and boots, oh, the boots had to shine like the crown jewels. A dull spot could be interpreted as laziness. Laziness meant a bad reference, and a bad reference might as well be a death sentence in servant society. Silver polishing alone could take hours. You'd sit hunched over a table, rubbing away tarnish with elbow grease and whispers of regret. The polish was often made from ammonia, chalk, and vinegar, meaning your hands stung, your nostrils burned, and your faith in humanity eroded slowly with each spoon you scrubbed. And just when you thought you'd finished, surprise, it was time to start over because someone touched the silver with their flesh hands again. Spring cleaning in a Victorian household was not the chirpy let's throw out old Tupperware event it is today. It was a violent, multi-day event that required stamina, bravery, and at least 3 other people holding onto your ankles while you leaned out a window to wash the glass. Everything, and we mean everything, had to be taken apart, aired out, scrubbed, reassembled, and presented like a showroom. Mattresses were dragged outside and beaten until the feathers gave up. Chimneys were swept, usually by children or small adults with flexible morals, and drapes were unhooked, laundered, and ironed so perfectly they looked like they'd never been used. This process was so intense that many servants kept spring cleaning journals just to track which parts of the house had been conquered, and which ones were still plotting their dusty revenge. The whole operation often included boiling vinegar on stoves to cut through the grime, which made the house smell like a salad on fire and did wonders for everyone's sinuses. Cleaning tools in the Victorian era were, charitably, rudimentary. You had mops made of rag bundles, brooms made of bound twigs, and brushes of every shape and stiffness. Polishing cloths were often repurposed undergarments, and cleaning solutions ranged from lemon juice and lye to outright poison, arsenic wallpaper dust. Anyone? If you were lucky, the house had running water, but in many cases you hauled it up from a pump or well. Hot water, that required a fire, so before you could scrub anything, you had to start a miniature forge in the scullery just to warm the water enough to remove last week's coal stains from the marble floor. Your master only walks on to reach the drawing room, he never uses. Here's the kicker. After all this work, the end goal wasn't praise, it was invisibility. If you did your job right, no one noticed. If you did it wrong, even slightly, you'd get called out, written up, or fired for slovenly habits. So the only real reward was waking up tomorrow to do it all again. Same vinegar, same polish, same existential dread. Your only companions? The dust, the damp, and maybe a sympathetic housemaid who'll sneak you a biscuit if you cry quietly enough in the broom closet. So yes, Victorian houses were beautiful. Just don't ask who made them that way, because behind every dazzling chandelier and spotless floor was a servant with cracked knuckles, sore knees, and an intimate knowledge of how to make brass shine like betrayal. Cleaning was not just a duty, it was a lifestyle, a punishment, and sometimes a comedy, the dark, dusty kind that makes you laugh only so you won't cry. If you've ever felt mildly inconvenienced by a load of laundry, buckle up. Victorian servants would like a word, or rather, a scream, because doing the wash in the 19th century wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a full-contact, soul-crushing endurance trial involving caustic soaps, dangerous equipment, and a strong risk of spontaneous arm dislocation. Clothes may have made the master look sharp, but they left the servant looking like they'd wrestled an angry squid in a tub of lye. Victorian laundry began with boiling, not warm water. Boiling. Clothes were dumped into massive copper tubs filled with water, soap, and often soda crystals or lye, substances capable of burning off not just dirt, but also a few layers of skin if you weren't careful. The laundry maid's day began early, sweating over a raging fire to heat the tubs, stirring the pot like some tragic laundry witch. And this wasn't a small batch operation. Think sheets, undergarments, lace collars, trousers, and enough petticoats to wallpaper a medium-sized castle. Also, keep in mind whites were supposed to be white. The blinding retinas on fire kind of white that meant one missed spot of tea stain could unleash fury from the lady of the house. If scrubbing didn't do the trick, some maids resorted to laying the items out in the sun, sprinkled with lemon juice or bleach. The result? You might lose the stain, your fingerprints, and possibly your will to live. After boiling came scrubbing, which was performed on wooden washboards that had roughly the same comfort level as a medieval torture device. Maids would spend hours hunched over, scrubbing collars, cuffs, and socks until their fingers were raw and their backs were one bad twist away from permanent curvature. Once the dirt had been removed, the clothes were then beaten into further submission, literally, with paddles, mallets, or by smacking them against a stone slab. Clothes didn't just have to be clean, they had to be as flat and pliable as possible before rinsing. The concept of delicate cycle did not exist, neither did elbow-friendly ergonomics or mercy. Once your boiling and beating marathon had ended, it was time to wring out the water. This meant twisting massive sheets and garments by hand, unless the household was fortunate, read rich enough to have a hand-cranked wringer. This device looked like a pasta roller from hell, with thick wooden rollers designed to squeeze water out of fabrics, and if you weren't careful, also your fingers. Drying came next, which might sound like a reprieve, but it wasn't. In winter, laundry was hung around the scullery or kitchen, making it smell like wet wool and cabbage stew. In summer, it went outside, only to be chased by unpredictable rain, passing dogs, or the neighbor's equally grim laundry line. Ironing was its own special form of punishment. Irons in the Victorian era weren't plugged into a wall, they were solid hunks of metal, heated directly on a stove. They weighed between 5 and 15 pounds and cooled down quickly, meaning the process involved rotating several irons, one in use, one reheating, one cooling. If you didn't rotate fast enough, your linen got cold. Rotate too fast, and you scorched a hole right through the master's waistcoat. Either way, congratulations, you're fired. Ironing lace was its own test of precision, as it had to be starched until it could stand on its own, then pressed without crumpling. Some maids used special mini-irons for collars and cuffs, which were like holding hot potatoes with handles. Burn marks on your hands, common. Ironing induced tears, encouraged to be cried in private, as if washing and ironing clothes wasn't traumatic enough. Servants also had to wear uniforms that could double as a straitjacket made of starched misery. Think high collars, tight sleeves, and fabric that scratched. It had to be spotless, always. A single mark, smudge, or crease meant either a lecture, a fine, or being told to scrub the front steps until the flagstones confessed to a crime. And no, you didn't get to dress for comfort. If you were serving dinner, you wore formal black with a crisp white apron. Dusting the drawing room, change into something less offensive to the drapes. Every duty had a look, and every look had a pile of cleaning attached to it. That, of course, you would also be responsible for. Here's the kicker. By the time you finished the week's laundry, guess what? It was already dirty again. Underwear, stockings and linens were changed regularly, at least for the upper classes, and it was your job to make it seem like a team of magical elves had cleaned, pressed and replaced them. Laundry was the task that never ended, a Sisyphean cycle of soap, steam and soul erosion. And worst of all, you didn't even get to wear any of the nice stuff. You just risked spinal injury to make sure someone else's monogrammed handkerchief didn't have a wrinkle. In conclusion, the Victorian laundry room was not a whimsical corner where clothes came out smelling like lavender and fresh air. It was a battleground, one where your enemies were endless linens, molten hot irons, and a laundry basket that multiplied like rabbits. So next time you complain about sorting your colors, just remember, you weren't the one boiling your employer's underwear over open fire. Being a Victorian servant wasn't just about polishing, scrubbing, hauling, ironing, and generally suffering. It was also a delicate dance of social etiquette, so rigid it made the rules of chess look like freestyle jazz. Imagine living in a world where one misstep, one mistimed glance, one ill-advised good morning could mean the difference between job security and being tossed out on your petticoats with nothing but a tarnished spoon and a bruised ego. Let's begin with the most important rule of all. Do not, under any circumstances, behave like a human being. That means no making eye contact with your employer, ever. If you must exist in their presence, which ideally you shouldn't, then do so quietly, invisibly, and preferably sideways. Eye contact was considered presumptuous. Speaking was borderline treason. And smiling, what are you, a duke? If you were lucky enough and unlucky enough to be in the same room as your employer, you'd better hope you'd mastered the sacred art of looking like wallpaper. This wasn't shyness. This was survival. Servants were expected to exist in an eerie bubble of silence, to be ever present but never intrusive. The goal was to become so efficient and silent that your master might wonder if the house was haunted by a very tidy ghost. But the social rules didn't stop at the door of the drawing room. Oh no, even downstairs, among your fellow soot-covered, bunion-blessed brethren, there existed a labyrinth of hierarchy that would have made Napoleon sweat. There was a pecking order among servants, and peck they did. At the top, the butler, smugly polishing his silver and sipping the leftover port. Just beneath him, the housekeeper, a woman of stern bun and sterner judgment, who could instill terror with a single sniff. Then came the footman, tall, attractive, and hired to look decorative in livery, followed by a plummeting cascade of maids, cooks, scullions, and children, whose job was simply to scrub the scullion. Even among maids there were tiers. Ladies' maids and nursemaids were nearly aristocrats compared to the scullery maid, whose role was to be constantly damp, soot-streaked, and elbow-deep in dishwater. Respect followed this internal ranking with near military discipline. If you were lower than someone, you curtied. If you were higher, you glared. The housekeeper could scold you for your hemline, but woe unto her if she overstepped and contradicted the butler, lest the whole operation descend into class warfare with mops as weapons. Then there were the rules around meals. You didn't just flop down in the servants' hall and dive into stew. Oh no, seating was assigned according to your rank. The higher-ups got the best chairs with legs that didn't wobble, and occasionally pudding. The lowest ranks sat near the door, inhaled whatever scraps remained, and tried not to make eye contact with the cook, whose temper was a separate ecosystem of fear. You could technically refuse a dish, but doing so might mean fasting for 36 hours and never being allowed near the gravy boat again. As for personal time, let's all have a hearty laugh. Days off were mythical, like unicorns or kind employers. If you were granted one, it happened once a month, maybe. This half-day was just long enough to stagger into town, buy a new pair of stockings with your sixpence of wages, and run back to the house before the mistress noticed the dust on the staircase and blamed your absence for the moral collapse of the empire. Even sleep was subject to social rules. Lower-ranking servants didn't get bedrooms. They got converted cupboards, storage rooms, or nests under the stairs that made Harry Potter's closet look like a Hilton suite. You were lucky to have a straw mattress, and even luckier if the rats weren't unionizing in your pillow. Of course, if you were ever caught dozing where you shouldn't, like say after working an 18-hour day, scrubbing soot from a chimney with a toothbrush, you could be written up for slothfulness. In short, sleep was for aristocrats and corpses. What's truly bizarre is how thoroughly internalized these rules became. Servants would often police each other more strictly than the employers did. It was a badge of pride to know your place, literally and figuratively. Deference became an instinct, like breathing, except more exhausting. There was no complaining, there was no gossiping, unless you were very careful and very quiet and very sure the footman wasn't listening through the wall, which he probably was. There was only the grim ballet of etiquette, enforced not just by the aristocracy, but by the servants themselves. It was as if the household operated on an invisible code, not quite chivalry, not quite tyranny, but definitely a nightmare with napkins. So next time you think your office job has too many Slack channels and passive-aggressive emails, just remember, at least no one can demote you from pudding access or write you up for too much blinking. You've spent your entire adult life on your feet, waking before sunrise, scrubbing grime out of brass with your fingernails, and serving soup to people who consider eye contact a disciplinary offense. And now, finally, you're 65, or maybe 55, but with the joints of a 90-year-old. You dream of restful afternoons, perhaps in a sunny garden, sipping tea with trembling hands and reminiscing about that one time you almost got to sit down during a dinner service. Well, Victorian England has a different retirement plan in mind. Don't stop working until you're gone, and if you do stop, kindly disappear. For most servants, retirement wasn't a phase of life. It was a financial and existential cliff. Unlike their employers who retired to country estates with pensions, family inheritances and overstuffed armchairs, elderly servants were often shown the door the moment they could no longer lug coal or lift an iron the weight of a small cannon. And this wasn't framed as cruelty, it was practicality. The Victorian equivalent of, sorry but you've become a cost centre. Dismissal could be swift and final. No notice, no golden handshake, just a worn carpet bag, and instructions not to let the door hit you on the way out. If you were lucky, and luck in this context means someone slightly less heartless than a wet brick, you might get a teacup. Yes, a single lonely teacup, not a pension, not even the set, just one delicate porcelain vessel as a sentimental thank you for 4 decades of domestic servitude. Perhaps it came with a saucer, but let's not get greedy. Some were sent to almshouses, the Victorian version of assisted living, minus the assisted, and about as cheerful as a brick cellar in February. These institutions were grim, heavily moralistic, and funded just enough to keep their residents upright, but not comfortable. Think of them as the final reward for a life of obedient toil, a bed, thin porridge, and roommates who snored like Victorian furnaces. Others, if they had family, might crawl back to the countryside and rely on younger relatives, assuming those relatives weren't already buried in debt or trying to feed 7 children on the wage of a chimney sweep. Extended family support was a gamble, one often lost. A former footman might end up sleeping in a stable loft or begging from the very people he once served foie gras to. The incredibly fortunate, a tiny candle-lit percentage were those who had served one family for decades and had somehow wormed their way into being part of the household. A phrase that sounds loving but still came with no legal rights. These loyal few were sometimes allowed to remain in the household as companions or old retainers, a vague role that mostly involved shuffling slowly from one room to another and being quietly ignored. Occasionally they might be given a small room and the honorary task of talking to the cat. But again, there were no pensions, no savings accounts, no health insurance. If your back gave out, if arthritis turned your hands into clawed relics, if your eyesight failed, you didn't get a doctor, you got dismissed. And if you couldn't keep up, well, there was always the workhouse, where hope went to die in regulation-issue trousers. The most heartbreaking part? Many servants accepted this without bitterness. The Victorian ideal of loyalty ran deep, and servants were often taught from childhood that their lot was to serve without complaint and exit without fanfare. A housemaid who received a parting gift, say, the hand-me-down shawl of a minor duchess, might consider herself lucky beyond words. "She remembered me," the maid would whisper, clutching her gift, ignoring the fact that the duchess hadn't remembered to leave money for her burial. Servitude in the Victorian age wasn't just physically taxing, it was emotionally rigged. Your entire identity was tethered to being useful, so when you weren't, you became invisible. The only retirement party you got was the quiet click of the door behind you, and maybe, if your luck held strong, a commemorative biscuit tin to gather dust beside your regrets.